In a locked drawer in Florence, a small glass vial rests on its side. The label reads, Manna di San Nicola, the manna of Saint Nicholas, a holy blessing, a cure-all for the faithful. The residue inside, dried to a crystalline ghost, tells a different story: white arsenic, lead, and belladonna. A woman who dabbed this onto her wrist or into her husband's broth did not receive a saint's grace. She received an inheritance powder, slow, tasteless, and legally invisible. The vial is not a relic of mercy. It is a receipt for a quiet murder, signed by the chemistry of the Renaissance apothecary. This is the hidden history of arsenic, a substance that promised beauty, cured syphilis, killed beetles, and turned Victorian nurseries into low-dose gas chambers. A substance that still leaches from the wood of suburban decks and the water pumps of Bangladesh. The poison never had a signature. It only had a disguise. This is the Deep Archive. We leave the surface behind. The hatch seals. Pressure builds. Dark water closes over the vessel. The beam cuts narrow through the black, searching for what was stored below the reach of daylight. Sealed files. Glass cases. A fragment of emerald wallpaper still exhaling trimethylarsine after 140 years. A white lace glove dusted with the same pigment that killed an emperor in a damp St. Helena room. A porcelain cup from a French courtroom, its rose pattern innocent, its contents once invisible to every test except the marsh mirror. That dark bloom inside a glass tube, the first time chemistry could see what the hand had done. The archive drawer slides open, the monitor ticks upward, and the story we thought was over begins to breathe again. The alabaster jar sits in a shallow niche cut into the limestone wall of a Roman tomb. Light from a conservator's lamp catches the inner curve, and there it is, a faint stain, a shimmer of gold no thicker than a memory. The pigment is orpiment, an arsenic sulfide that Egyptian artisans once ground fine enough to line the eyes of the living and decorate the passageways of the dead. It was a color of stolen sunlight, a promise that the body could carry radiance into eternity. There is nothing threatening in the jar. It is simply a cosmetic vessel, sealed by centuries of silence. But the stain has a longer story than the jar, and the story begins not with gold but with flame. In the 4th century before the Common Era, the Greek philosopher Theophrastus, a student of Aristotle who turned his attention from the heavens to the minerals underfoot, recorded a procedure. Take a mineral called realgar, another arsenic sulfide, a crystalline orange bloom that forms in the fissures of volcanic rock. Roast it carefully over a charcoal fire. What emerges is not a golden powder, but a white one, fine as milled chalk, and it comes with 2 properties that would outlast any empire. Arsenic trioxide is tasteless. It is odorless. It dissolves invisibly into liquid in the tissues of the human stomach. The Greek record describes a chemical curiosity. It does not name a murderer, but the powder was now a fact, and a fact, once written, becomes portable. The light moves across the shallow curve of the jar, and the gold responds, not with the dullness of aged metal, but with a living gleam, as if the pigment remembers the hand that once dipped into it. Egyptian women of rank applied this powder with a slender stick of wood or bone, drawing a line that extended from the corner of the eye toward the temple. The aesthetic was not merely cosmetic, it was protective, a charm against the evil eye that required the eye itself to be gilded. Tomb paintings at Thebes show ladies with golden-lidded gazes, their profiles sharp against the ochre walls. The pigment they used came from the same geological veins that produced the Nile's gold, but it was cheaper, more available, and infinitely more treacherous. The artisan who ground the stone in a workshop near the river probably sniffed the dust as it rose. He might have developed a cough, a staining of the fingers, a slow numbness in the extremities. The record does not preserve his complaints. It preserves only the finished product, a cosmetic container, a painted eye, a funeral mask gleaming with arsenic yellow. This is where the story begins, in the overlap between decoration and death. But the turning point is Greek. When Theophrastus set down his recipe, he was not inventing a poison. He was documenting a transformation. Relgar, he observed, could be roasted in a covered pot until it sublimated and recondensed as a white smoke. Collected carefully, that smoke became a powder, arsenic trioxide. The text is a model of empirical clarity. The kind of stone, the temperature of the fire, the vessel's shape. There is no moral commentary. There is simply the instruction, as neutral as a cookbook. And because the instruction existed, it could be copied, translated, and carried across borders. Alexandria archived it. Arab scholars later translated it. Byzantine physicians experimented with it in minute doses for skin ailments. But in the Roman world, the recipe found its most notorious application. The strange part was not that it worked, but that nobody considered its shadow half until the shadow had a name. That name was Locusta, and she appears in the Roman histories, not as a chemist, but as a functionary of succession. Tacitus describes her with a clinical reluctance, a woman who understood plants, minerals, and the private schedules of the powerful. Agrippina the Younger, the fourth wife of Emperor Claudius, required an efficient and discreet removal. Her son, Nero, needed the throne. The palace was full of food tasters, guards, and political enemies. A stabbing was loud. A fall was unreliable. Claudius was elderly, but not dying quickly enough. Locusta supplied the solution in a form that must have looked like a pinch of salt, a dusting of fine flour, a corrective for the digestion. The political climate that welcomed Locusta was one of chronic instability. The Julio-Claudian dynasty was a family enterprise run on suspicion, favor, and the constant risk of physical elimination. Claudius himself had ascended after the assassination of Caligula, found cowering behind a curtain, and his reign was marked by senatorial executions and the relentless maneuvering of his wives. Agrippina, his fourth wife, and his niece, was a woman of formidable political intelligence. She had already manipulated the adoption of her son Nero into the line of succession, but Claudius was showing signs of favoring his biological son Britannicus. Time was shortening. A natural death might come too late. Agrippina needed a guarantee. Locusta entered the stage as a practitioner already established. Ancient sources suggest she had been convicted of poisoning before, and Agrippina drew her from confinement, offering protection in exchange for a discreet service. The service was rendered. The emperor dined on mushrooms, perhaps enoki or Amanita caesarea, themselves edible but easily confused with toxic varieties. The first course made him ill but did not kill him. Accounts vary. Some say he vomited, which partially purged the dose, and a second administration was needed. Another story claims his physician, Gaius Stertinius Xenophon, was part of the plot and introduced the final dose under the guise of a medicinal feather inserted into the throat to induce vomiting. The feather, it is said, was coated with arsenic trioxide. The truth is irretrievable, but the mechanism is consistent. A tasteless powder introduced into a vulnerable moment of bodily relief, completing the circuit between ingestion, absorption, and collapse. The body of the emperor cooled in the palace, and Agrippina sealed the succession before the news could spread. The Praetorian Guard proclaimed Nero emperor. Locusta was granted a full pardon and a property in the countryside, and for a time, she flourished as a practical resource. Later emperors, including Nero himself, are said to have employed her expertise for their own political tidyings. She became a living archive of toxic technique, a node through which the mineral's destructive potential passed from the laboratory bench to the imperial bedchamber. The clinical profile of arsenic poisoning is worth describing here, because it explains why the substance remains so effective for centuries. In acute poisoning, the initial phase resembles severe gastrointestinal distress, vomiting, diarrhea, abdominal pain. The victim becomes dehydrated, the pulse weakens, and the extremities turn cold. If the dose is high enough, death occurs within 24 hours from circulatory collapse. Chronic, low-level dosing mimics a dozen other conditions: fatigue, weight loss, nerve tingling, skin discoloration, confusion. The physician at the bedside cannot distinguish it from pernicious anemia, tuberculosis, or simple wasting disease. The body offers no unique signature, only the accumulation of circumstantial evidence, multiple victims, a pattern of sudden inheritances. A servant's testimony raises suspicion. And in antiquity, neither the autopsy nor the chemical test could confirm it. The poisoner's only enemy was gossip. So Locusta's powder became a political instrument of almost philosophical perfection. It required no force. It did not interrupt the dinner conversation. It could be administered by a trusted hand, a wife, a son, a physician, a slave, and the instant of administration was invisible to the victim. The poison hid inside the ritual of care. That is the enduring horror of it, not the suffering, which was no worse than other violent deaths, but the intimacy. The emperor raised his cup to his lips, perhaps toasting the gods or his own health, and swallowed the agent of his dissolution from a vessel that had been filled by someone he trusted. The alabaster jar, sealed in the tomb, represents the other half of this cultural practice. The jar was not a murder weapon. It was a cosmetic container, used by a woman who wanted to appear beautiful in death as in life. She might have been a matron of a senatorial family, a freedwoman of means, or a merchant's daughter. Her tomb included the jar alongside a bronze mirror, a bone comb, a small glass perfume bottle. The orpiment inside was a luxury, a pigment that offered a golden sheen unmatched by other minerals. To grind it into a smooth paste, she would have mixed it with animal fat or vegetable gum, using a stone palette. The process was messy. The pigment stained cloth, skin, and wood, and if she applied it often enough, the arsenic might have seeped through the delicate skin of her eyelids into her bloodstream. Did she suffer from headaches, a chronic weariness, a numbness in her fingers? The bones are silent, but the possibility is there, a quiet cost inscribed into her beauty routine. The connection between the cosmetic jar and the murder powder is not metaphorical, it is chemical. Orpiment is arsenic trisulfide, a stable compound that resists absorption unless the particle size is fine enough or unless it is ingested deliberately. Relgar is arsenic disulfide, and when heated in air, it oxidizes into arsenic trioxide, the white powder of Locusta. The same element, the same geological origin, two different expressions achieved by the application of heat. The artisans who painted the tomb walls and the poisoners who cleared the succession line were both reaching into the same pocket of the Earth's crust. They simply turn the stone in different directions. The tomb itself is a record of this ambiguity. Archaeologists now wear gloves and masks when handling such artifacts, not because of immediate danger, but because of the residue, the dust that rises when the jar is moved, the crystalline fragments that cling to the alabaster surface. The golden shimmer is beautiful, but it is also a warning. The pigment has decayed over centuries, exuding an odor that some conservators describe as faintly garlic-like, a signature of arsenic's volatility. The tomb's dry air has preserved it, but also concentrated it. To open the jar is to release a tiny puff of ancient poison, a breath of the first death. The Roman legions marched, the roads were built, the aqueducts carried water, and all the while, the white powder traveled in the baggage of apothecaries and in the notes of medical men. It was prescribed in tiny doses for intermittent fevers, sometimes successfully, because arsenic does kill certain microbes and parasites. The Greeks called it sandarak and used it as a pigment and a medicine simultaneously. The Romans called it arenicum and debated its hazards. Galen, the great physician of the 2nd century, wrote of its corrosive power on ulcers. The substance passed from hand to hand, from empire to empire, never entirely disappearing, always keeping its double nature. It would wait centuries to enter the wallpaper factories of Europe, the cosmetic recipes of the Renaissance, the pesticide tanks of American orchards. But the initial contract was signed in Rome, when a political murder demonstrated that the tasteless powder could rewrite inheritance lines without leaving a mark. The chapter ends here, in the stillness of the tomb, but the story does not. The golden dust has already scattered. Some of it will settle into the paint of medieval manuscripts, where monks will illuminate sacred texts with orpiment yellow, breathing the dust as they work. Some will find its way into the apothecary shops of Naples and Palermo, where a woman named Giulia Tofana will distill it into a liquid so gentle it requires only a few drops in a bowl of soup. The alabaster jar is just the first vessel. There will be others, green wallpapers, tiny vials, deep wells. For now, though, it is enough to stand before this small container in this dark room and note how the light catches the gold. The stain is a chemical memory. The memory is a debt that has not yet been called in. In a drawer that has not been opened since the late 17th century, a small glass vial rests on its side. The light finds its thick, slightly irregular glass, hand-blown in a Tuscan workshop where the craftsman's concern was not symmetry but containment. A sepia label, the ink now faded to the color of dried walnut, reads, Manna di San Nicola. The name promises something nourishing, a miraculous provision from a saint known for secret gifts. A pious woman might dab it on her wrists before Mass, believing in its power to calm the spirit or brighten the skin. But the dried residue inside tells a more sober story. Through the lens of modern spectrometry, the crystalline ghost resolves into a trinity of patience: white arsenic, lead, and the nightshade alkaloid belladonna. It is a compound designed to dissolve into wine or broth or a moist compress without a whisper of taste or color. This formulation was the achievement of Giulia Tofana, an apothecary who moved through Palermo, Naples, and Rome in the middle of the 17th century, reading the hidden anatomy of Renaissance marriage as carefully as she read her mother's recipes. Her clients were noblewomen pinned under the weight of dynastic contracts, merchants' wives whose dowries had evaporated into a husband's debts, and others who lived inside a legal system where divorce was theologically impossible and annulment a privilege of the powerful few. In a world where a man's authority over his household was nearly absolute, Tofana offered not a rebellion but a quiet exit, a small glass bottle no larger than a thumb filled with a fluid that looked like rosewater or a devotional essence. She called it Aqua Tofana, and she sold it alongside cosmetic creams, scented oils, and other unremarkable items of a lady's toilette. The transaction was invisible. A servant could collect it with a list of groceries. A woman could tuck it into her sleeve during a church service. The bottle became an extension of the domestic sphere, a secret folded between a prayer book and a small pot of rouge. The liquid worked with a slow, almost bureaucratic precision. Arsenic trioxide formed the core, a tasteless, odorless white powder that, when administered in small, repeated doses, mimicked the natural decline of a wasting disease. Lead acetate, soluble and cumulative, added to the systemic load, while the trace of belladonna could dilate the pupils slightly or induce a low fever, symptoms that a physician trained in galenic humors would read as a melancholic distemper or an infection of the bile. A man would sicken over weeks. First a loss of appetite and a creeping fatigue, then a coldness in his hands, vomiting, diarrhea, and finally a quiet collapse of the organs. To the parish priest and the attending doctor, it looked like cholera or a gastric fever or simply a mortal tide that no art could turn. The widow would wear black and order a mass for the soul, and no one would think to lift the small vial of manna from her dressing table and ask what saint had blessed it. The poison was an accountant, not a soldier. It kept its own ledger, and it balanced the books over time. Tofana's operation thrived because she understood not only the chemistry of alkaloids, but the sociology of quiet exchanges. She did not advertise in the piazza. She distributed through a network of midwives, herbalists, and ladies' cosmeticians, women who could recognize a bruised arm or a tightened jaw and offer, in a lowered voice, a different sort of relief. The vial labeled Mana di San Nicola was a brilliant cipher. It invoked the patron saint of sailors, children, and the shipwrecked, offering a harbor to those drowning in a matrimony they could not legally flee. The poison was never forced, it was chosen, and that choice was what made it so corrosive to the social fabric. When Tofana was eventually arrested, tried, and executed in Rome in 1659, legend claimed she confessed to involvement in the deaths of over 600 men. Historians now suspect the number was inflated by panic and the authorities' need to publish a terrifying figure. But the panic itself was genuine. The state realized that it had not been defending against a solitary criminal, but against the dispersed, feminine infrastructure of soft conspiracy that had learned to weaponize the very objects the culture associated with tenderness and grace. The strange part was not that the liquid killed. It was that its entire mechanism depended on the symbols that made society trust itself. A cosmetic flask promised the refinement of beauty. A holy oil bottle promised the channeling of divine mercy. Both were invisible to scrutiny because they occupied the intimate geography of a woman's private room, as ordinary as a comb or a rosary. By disguising a slow-acting chemical agent as a tool of adornment or devotion, Tofana had taken the culture's own categories of innocence and turned them into operational assets. A husband might check his wife's letters or interrogate her friends, but he would never uncork her bottle of San Nicolas manna and sip it. The danger was not concealed inside the poison. It was concealed inside the blessing. The method did not remain confined to Italy. A generation later, the same logic surfaced at Versailles, where the affair of the poisons erupted in 1679. and tore a permanent fissure in the French court's relationship with secrecy. The trail began with Catherine Deschays, known as La Voisine, a fortune teller whose Paris salon attracted aristocrats seeking love charms, horoscopes, and services far more final. Under the guise of palm reading and esoteric counsel, La Voisine and her associates sold what they called poudres de succession, inheritance powders, based again on white arsenic, sometimes mixed with ground glass or other irritants to accelerate the symptoms. Her client books, when seized, included the names of counts, duchesses, and royal functionaries, and the investigation spiraled until it brushed against the Marquise de Montespan, the king's own mistress. Louis XIV, recoiling from the political radiation, ordered the testimony sealed and the proceedings halted, but the damage had already metastasized. The poison had not merely eliminated relatives and rivals, it had revealed that the court's entire architecture of manners, piety, and benign ritual was a thin plaster over a subsoil of transactional fear. The affair of the poisons changed the texture of daily life at Versailles. After the trials, a courtier who received a small bottle of scent or a cosmetic gift no longer saw an ornament of favor. She saw a possible contract, a policy of domestic removal sealed not by a minister's signature but by a clear liquid in a delicate flask. A dressing table became a site of latent audit. The margin between a complexion lotion and a lethal dose had collapsed, and it would never be fully restored. The state attempted to legislate clarity by restricting the sale of toxic substances, but, as with every attempt to regulate the invisible, the edict arrived after the suspicion had already calcified into habit. Knowledge, once inhaled, cannot be excised by decree. Here lies the paradox that binds Tophana's Apothecary to the salons of Versailles. The very vessels that promised beauty and piety, cosmetic flasks, holy oil bottles, devotional vials, became the unobtrusive delivery systems for inheritance. A cosmetic bottle promised a smoother brow. A holy oil promised a calmer soul. When these objects were repurposed to smooth the passage into widowhood, they did not alter their external shape. They remained graceful, familiar, and serene. The poison did not announce itself on the label. It murmured through the chemistry, and only the initiated could hear. The lie resided not in the glass, but in the word, a saint's name, a blessing, a cosmetic claim that reframed a calculated death as a commonplace of feminine maintenance. It was, in a clinical sense, the polite violence of chemistry, administered through the instruments of trust. The sealed vial in the Florentine apothecary drawer, its sepia script still legible, is not a relic of a solved problem. It is the fossil of a negotiation that never truly ceased. The apothecary who kept it may have been a supplier, a curious hoarder, or a man who simply forgot a dark curiosity in a locked compartment. But the drawer itself, cool, dry, cataloged in a museum's climate-controlled archive, now serves as a holding cell for the object's unfinished ambiguity. The label still reads, Mana di San Nicola, and the glass still holds its faint white residue, dormant after 3 centuries, but chemically unchanged. Its presence asks a question that cannot be answered by a simple ban or a regulatory act. What else, in the quiet corners of domestic life, wears a coat of comfort while carrying a quiet, accumulative death? The answer does not belong to the 17th century alone. It repeats wherever the line between care and harm is drawn by intimacy, policed by trust, and redrawn only after the body has long since signed for the delivery. The dressing table knew first, not the woman who sat before it, nor the physician who would later stand helpless at her bedside. but the table itself, dark polished wood bearing the pale dust of a ritual repeated until it became invisible. On its surface rested a porcelain saucer, and on the saucer lay a half-eaten wafer, its remaining edge sharp as a broken promise. The powder around it was fine as milled silence, and it did not blow away when the window was opened, because it had already begun to settle into the grain of the wood, into the fibers of the lace runner, into the lungs of the room. This was not evidence of a crime. It was evidence of a beauty practice, which in the 19th century could be precisely the same thing. The wafer was an arsenic complexion wafer, sold in fashionable London shops and advertised in ladies' journals with language that would, a century later, read like a confession. Perfectly harmless, the copy insisted. Produces a clear, transparent complexion. The word transparent did the work that the word pale could not. Pallor suggested illness, anemia, the tubercular decline that Victorians romanticized but still feared. Transparency suggested something more refined, a skin so pure it seemed to admit light, a face that belonged to a being of higher sensibility, a body that had transcended the coarse redness of ordinary health. The wafer promised to deliver this transcendence, and the wafer delivered it because it contained arsenic trioxide, the same tasteless, odorless powder that had settled accounts in Roman dining rooms and Renaissance bedchambers. The dose was small. The dose was repeated. The dose was cumulative. The dose was death. But death was precisely what the complexion was meant to resemble. The logic was older than the wafer, older than the Victorian drawing room, older even than the chemical name that Scheele had given to the green pigment in 1775. It reached back to the 16th century, when Italian beauty manuals began recommending depilatory creams made with orpiment, the golden arsenic sulfide that Egyptian artisans had once used to paint the eyes of the dead. The manual's author, a physician named Giovanni Marinello, described the preparation without alarm: a paste of orpiment, quicklime, and water, applied to the face to remove unwanted hair and leave behind a surface of remarkable smoothness. The skin, he wrote, would become alabaster-like. He did not need to explain why a noblewoman would want her skin to resemble alabaster. Alabaster was the material of tomb effigies and saintly statuary. It was the complexion of women who had already left the earthly body behind, who existed now in the arrested perfection of stone. The cream burned away the hair, and, with it, the evidence of ordinary vitality. The woman who used it did not merely remove a cosmetic flaw. She entered a long negotiation with the mineral that would eventually hold her in its own stillness. The mechanism was transdermal, though no one in Marinello's Italy would have used that word. Arsenic compounds applied to the skin absorb through the epidermis and enter the capillary circulation, from which they distribute to the liver, kidneys, and peripheral nerves. The body, sensing an intruder, mounts a defense it cannot sustain. Enzymes attempt to methylate the arsenic into less toxic forms, but the capacity for methylation is finite, and the repetition of the cosmetic dose overwhelms it by degrees. The first symptoms are subtle, which is to say they are beautiful. The skin lightens, the complexion clears, the hair thins, which for the depilatory user is precisely the intended result. The woman looking into the mirror sees success. She does not see the gradual disruption of keratin synthesis, the slow accumulation of arsenic in the nail beds, the quiet cellular mutiny that will, months or years later, present itself as fatigue, gastric disturbance, neuropathy, or a malignancy that the physician will record as idiopathic, meaning the cause is unknown, meaning the cause has been applied daily with a soft brush and returned to a glass bottle in a locked cabinet. The Victorian adoption of the arsenic wafer added a new dimension to this old transaction. It moved the poison from the surface of the skin to the interior of the digestive tract, and it did so not as an incidental contamination, but as a deliberate, measured, socially endorsed dietary supplement. The wafers were manufactured by a firm in Lancashire, pressed from starch and sugar and a precisely weighed quantity of white arsenic, enough to produce the desired cosmetic effect over weeks and months, not enough to kill in a single dose, which made them legal, which made them popular, which made them lethal in a way that the law could not address. A woman could buy them across the counter. She could carry them in a small enamel case, the kind that clicked shut with a sound like a polite door closing. She could dissolve one on her tongue after breakfast, another before bed, and she could watch in her mirror as the color drained from her cheeks in the most acceptable way imaginable. The medical journals of the period tell the other side of the mirror. In 1851, the same year the Arsenic Act attempted to regulate the sale of the uncolored poison, the Lancet reported on the case of a young woman who had been taking complexion wafers for 6 months. She presented with vomiting, diarrhea, and a peculiar bronzing of the skin, the opposite of the pallor she had sought, together with a tremor of the hands that made it difficult for her to hold a teacup. The attending physician recognized the symptoms as chronic arsenic poisoning and inquired about her cosmetics. She produced the enamel case. She was proud of it. She had not, she explained, been taking poison. She had been taking Dr. Campbell's arsenic complexion wafers, which were sold specifically for the purpose of improving the skin, and which her own sister had recommended, and which had, in fact, delivered exactly the translucent look she had desired for the first 3 months of their use. The physician recorded that she died 4 weeks later, still insisting that the wafers could not have been the cause, because the wafers were beautiful, and beauty could not be poisonous, and poison was something that happened to other women in other houses. The story that circulated alongside the wafers was the story of the Styrian peasants. British travelers to the Austrian province of Styria had returned with extraordinary accounts. The peasants there, they said, habitually ate small doses of white arsenic, building up a tolerance over years, until they could consume quantities that would kill an uninitiated Londoner. They did this, the accounts claimed, to improve their complexions, to strengthen their lungs for mountain climbing, and to enhance their sexual vigor. The reports appeared in respected journals, including the Edinburgh Medical Journal, and they were presented not as folklore, but as anthropological fact. A Styrian woodcutter, one correspondent wrote, would crumble a grain of arsenic onto a piece of bread each morning and swallow it. And he would continue doing so for the rest of his life, and he would die at 80 with clear skin and strong teeth, unless he stopped taking the arsenic, in which case he would die within a week from the shock of withdrawal. The Styrian story was almost certainly exaggerated. Modern toxicologists doubt that true arsenic tolerance can develop to the degree described, and some of the original accounts may have confused arsenic with other substances or with the deliberate misdirection of peasants who found it amusing to mislead inquisitive gentlemen. But the story had already detached itself from the truth and taken up residence in the imagination of the beauty market. It provided a narrative of safety, a folk precedent that made the wafer seem traditional rather than reckless. If sturdy Austrian mountaineers had been eating arsenic for generations, why should a delicate English rose not take a wafer to improve her complexion? The logic was ethnographic, not pharmacological. It used the authority of peasant wisdom to override the authority of chemistry, and it worked because it flattered the consumer. She was not a poisoner or a victim. She was a participant in an ancient, rustic secret. The Styrian woodcutter became, without his knowledge or consent, the scientific endorser of a product that was slowly killing women who would never climb a mountain in their lives. The body, in all of this, was keeping its own ledger. Arsenic is a metalloid, atomic number 33, intermediate between metals and non-metals in its chemical behavior. It binds to sulfhydryl groups and proteins, disabling the enzymes that govern cellular respiration. The cell suffocates internally while the body continues to breathe. The liver attempts to methylate the arsenic into monomethylarsenic acid and dimethylarsenic acid, which are more water-soluble and can be excreted in urine. The attempt is partial. The unmetabolized arsenic remains, accumulating in the keratin-rich tissues, hair, nails, skin, which is why forensic toxicologists can read a timeline of exposure in the cross-section of a strand of hair, each millimeter recording a week of the body's silent negotiation with a substance it never consented to host. The woman taking her daily wafer was, without knowing it, writing a diary in arsenic down the shaft of every hair on her head, and the diary recorded, with chemical precision, the date on which the negotiation would fail. The paradox was not that women poisoned themselves for beauty. The paradox was that the poison worked. It did, in fact, produce a pallor that read as refinement. It did clear the skin of the blemishes and flushes that betrayed emotion, exertion, or ordinary health. It replaced the living complexion with something closer to a daguerreotype, fixed, still, drained of the warm tones that spoke of circulation and appetite, and the body's embarrassing insistence on being alive. The arsenic eater became, in her own mirror, a living ghost, an image of the woman who had once existed, rendered in monochrome, suitable for framing, already halfway to the memorial portrait that would hang in the drawing room, while the mourners murmured about her delicate beauty and her tragic frailty. The dressing table that bore the powder and the wafer was, in this sense, an alchemical studio. Its mirror was not a simple reflective surface. It was a portal through which the woman could watch herself become the ideal she had been taught to want, and the ideal was a slow erasure. The creams, the powders, the wafers, the depilatory pastes, they composed a pharmacopoeia of negation, a set of substances whose shared function was to suppress the evidence of the body's animal continuance. The arsenic did not merely improve the skin, it reduced the body's claims upon the identity. It quieted the metabolic noise. It made the face legible as a sign of gentility rather than as a record of lived experience, and it did so by gradually disabling the systems that made gentility unnecessary, because the dead require no social performance. The bottle was small enough to disappear in a dressing table drawer, but large enough to alter a life. The dose was measured in grains, not grams, but the grain was repeated until it weighed more than the body it was reshaping. The strangest part of the arsenic complexion phenomenon was not that it caused death. Every substance causes death at some dose, but that the death it caused was indistinguishable in its early stages from the beauty it promised. The pallor, the stillness, the translucent delicacy, these were both the desired cosmetic effect and the earliest clinical signs of poisoning. The woman who looked in the mirror and saw success was seeing exactly the same visual data that a toxicologist would later interpret as evidence of systemic failure. The only difference was the frame. The mirror told her she was beautiful. The autopsy report would tell the coroner she had been dying for months, perhaps years, while admiring the evidence in the glass each morning. The wafer on the saucer was half-eaten. That was the detail that mattered. It had not been consumed in a single reckless act. It had been consumed across a threshold, divided between intention and hesitation. Perhaps because the tea had been finished, the morning had been interrupted. The child had called from the next room. The woman had paused with the wafer in her mouth and then placed the remainder back on the porcelain, meaning to return to it, meaning to complete the dose, meaning to continue the project of self-fashioning that the wafer represented. She did return to it. The wafer was gone by evening. The saucer was wiped clean. The powder was renewed the next morning, and the next, and the morning after that, until the ritual became routine, and the routine became invisible, and the invisible substance did what invisible substances always do. It disappeared into the chemistry of the body, where it continued its work long after the woman had stopped thinking about it, because the poison does not need to be remembered to be effective. The poison only needs to be present. And in the dressing table drawer, and the enamel case, and the porcelain saucer, and the keratin of the woman's hair growing silently in the indifferent darkness, the poison was present for years. A child's bedroom in a London terrace, winter 1862. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight, a cold, persistent drizzle that worked its way into the mortar, the floorboards, the heavy velvet drapes. The room was papered floor to ceiling in the most fashionable shade of the season, a brilliant, luminous green, the color of new leaves in spring, of sunlit meadows, of life itself. It had been chosen with care by a mother who wanted beauty to surround her sleeping children. The pattern was an intricate botanical print, leaves and climbing vines that seemed almost to move in the flickering gaslight. The children who slept in that room had been ill for months. The doctor called it nervous exhaustion. The mother called it a mystery. The wallpaper called it nothing at all. It simply hung there, breathing. This is not a ghost story. It is a story about chemistry, fashion, empire, and the catastrophic human habit of mistaking danger for decoration. The chapter begins, as so many do in the deep archive, with a man in a laboratory and a color that the world had never seen before. The year was 1775. In the Swedish university town of Uppsala, a 32-year-old chemist named Carl Wilhelm Scheele was conducting a series of experiments on arsenic compounds. Scheele was a prodigy of pharmacy and metallurgy, a man whose hands knew the weight of every powder in the apothecary's cabinet. He had already discovered oxygen, though the credit would go to someone else. He had isolated chlorine, barium, and manganese. He had a gift for making the invisible visible. On this particular afternoon, he was heating a solution of sodium carbonate with arsenic trioxide and adding copper sulfate. The precipitate that formed at the bottom of his flask was a compound no one had cataloged before: copper arsenite. When he filtered it, washed it, and dried it, the result was a powder of such intense, vivid green that it seemed to glow against the gray stone of the laboratory bench. Scheele had not merely created a new chemical. He had birthed a new color, and the 19th century was about to fall in love with it. The pigment was named Scheele's green, and it solved a problem that had vexed artists and manufacturers for generations. Natural green pigments were a compromise. Plant-derived dyes faded in sunlight. Copper carbonate greens turned dull and brown over time, and mixtures of blue and yellow never achieved that singular, saturated freshness that the eye craved. Scheele's green did not fade. It did not dull. It was cheap to produce, easy to mix into oil paints, watercolors, and printing inks, and it could be applied to everything from canvas to cotton to heavy paper stock. By the early decades of the 1800s, it was everywhere. Wallpaper manufacturers ground it into their pasts. Textile mills dyed silk and wool with it. Confectioners used it to tint sugar flowers and cake decorations, a lively emerald. It colored artificial roses pinned to ball gowns, painted tin soldiers, the wax rinds of fake fruit arranged in dining room centerpieces. A child might wake to green wallpaper, dress in a green frock, play with green-painted wooden blocks, and eat a green-dusted sugar plum, all before noon. No one saw any reason to worry. The word arsenic appeared nowhere on the labels. It was just a color, just a pigment, just a pretty, harmless shade of spring. The truth, of course, was already hiding in the chemistry. Copper arsenite is not a stable compound in every environment. In dry conditions, it remains inert, its arsenic safely locked in the crystalline lattice, held tight by the copper bond. But the British Isles are not dry. They are damp, fogged, coal-smoked, and perpetually moist, and the interiors of Victorian homes were often sealed tight against drafts with heavy curtains, thick carpets, and tightly fitted doors. When the humidity in a room rose high enough, and when the wallpaper paste began to decompose, a slow organic process fed by the same molds that speckled the walls with black and gray, the arsenite pigment underwent a chemical transformation. Common household molds, particularly species of the genus Scopulariopsis, metabolized the inorganic arsenic in the pigment and converted it into something far more volatile, trimethylarsine, a gas. A colorless, toxic vapor that lifted gently from the surface of the wallpaper and drifted into the air of the room. The gas had a smell. It was faint, easy to miss, easy to dismiss. Those who noticed it described it as a slight garlic-like odor, a metallic breath that came and went. It was not unpleasant enough to raise alarm. It simply seemed like the stale air of a closed room, the kind of smell that dissipated if you opened a window. But in winter, windows stayed shut. And in nurseries, where children slept with doors closed, where damp nappies dried on wooden racks and small bodies breathed shallowly through the night, the gas accumulated. It was inhaled. It crossed the delicate membranes of the lungs and entered the bloodstream, and once inside, it performed the ancient, patient work that arsenic had been doing for centuries. It disrupted cellular respiration, interfered with enzyme function, and accumulated in hair, nails, and soft tissue. The dose was never large enough to kill outright. It was a low, chronic, insidious exposure, a poisoning so gradual that its symptoms mimicked a dozen other Victorian ailments: persistent headache, nausea, a creeping fatigue that made limbs heavy, a pallor that settled over the skin like chalk dust. Doctors diagnosed gastric fever, nervous prostration, the vague and all-purpose consumption. They prescribed rest, fresh air, and perhaps a change of scenery. They did not think to examine the wallpaper. The strange part was not that it worked. The strange part was that nobody knew why. For decades, the medical establishment dismissed the idea that wallpaper could kill as the superstition of nervous women and over-anxious mothers. When clusters of illness appeared in green-papered rooms, a family in Brighton whose 3 children wasted away one after another, a governess in Manchester who developed tremors and numbness after years of sleeping in a green bedroom, the cases were recorded as curiosities, not evidence. The wallpaper was beautiful. The wallpaper was expensive. The wallpaper was the height of taste. To suggest that taste itself might be lethal was an affront to the social order. It was easier to blame damp air, bad drains, moral weakness, the mysterious miasmas that were thought to carry disease. The gas was invisible. Its odor was intermittent. The connection between the green wall and the wasting body remained, for a long time, a rumor whispered in the margins of medical journals, a suspicion without a proof. The proof arrived in fragments from the very edge of empire. In 1821, Napoleon Bonaparte died in a damp, whitewashed room on the island of St. Helena, a remote British possession in the South Atlantic. The room had been recently redecorated. The walls were covered in a bright green wallpaper, chosen, perhaps, by a British governor who wanted the former emperor's quarters to look respectable, even cheerful. Napoleon's final months were a catalogue of suffering, abdominal pain, vomiting, swelling of the limbs, a progressive weakness that confined him to bed. His personal physician, Francesco Antomarchi, recorded the symptoms in detail. The official cause of death was stomach cancer. But the body did not rest easily in the archive. For a century and a half, historians, chemists, and forensic toxicologists chipped away at the story. They examined samples of Napoleon's hair, clipped from his head in the days after his death, and preserved by his loyal servants. The hair contained arsenic, levels that were elevated, persistent, and consistent with chronic exposure over many months. The wallpaper in his room was tested. It was Scheele's green, or possibly its more intense industrial descendant, Paris green, a copper acetoarsenite pigment that had been synthesized in 1814 to be even brighter, even more stable, even more widely used. The damp climate of St. Helena, combined with the sealed conditions of the sick room where fires burned to keep the dying man warm, would have provided the perfect conditions for the release of trimethylarsine. The conqueror of Europe, the architect of modern law and modern war, died not from the bullets of his enemies or the cancer that ate at his stomach, but possibly because the British had decorated his prison with tasteful, fashionable, fatal wallpaper. The irony is almost too precise to be believed, and historians still debate the certainty of the claim. But the fact that it is plausible at all is the point. The green pigment that killed, or at least helped to kill, the most famous man in the world was the same pigment that hung in nurseries, parlors, and hotel lounges across the British Empire. It was democratic in its reach, indifferent to rank. It did not care whether you were an emperor or an infant. It only cared whether the air was damp and the room was closed. The medical community began, slowly, to catch up. In 1857, a British physician named William Hines published a paper in The Lancet describing cases of illness he attributed to arsenic and wallpaper. He had tested the green paper in his own patients' homes and found the pigment soluble, transferable, and volatile. The paper caused a small scandal. Other doctors began to report similar findings. The great chemist and sanitary reformer Henry Letheby conducted experiments in London homes, hanging litmus paper in green-papered rooms and demonstrating that the air carried an arsenical vapor. By the 1870s, the evidence was overwhelming enough that manufacturers began to reformulate their pigments, searching for greens that did not rely on arsenic. They found alternatives in chromium oxide and cobalt green, and the era of arsenical wallpaper began to wane. But the wallpaper was still there, on the walls of old houses, layered under newer papers, waiting in the damp dark. It was not removed. It was simply covered over. Here is the sentence that the archive will not let go. The most desirable, lively shade of green became a silent executioner, turning domestic comfort into a low-dose gas chamber in which taste itself proved lethal. The wallpaper was not a weapon. It was a commodity, bought and sold in shops, recommended by decorators, admired by guests. The mothers who chose it for their children's rooms were not negligent. They were following fashion, adorning their homes with the best that industry could provide. The fault did not lie with them. It lay in the gap between what chemistry could make and what medicine could test, between the speed of innovation and the slowness of understanding. The factory that produced the pigment did not know it was producing a vector of poison. The doctor who diagnosed nervous exhaustion did not know he was treating a room. The child who slept surrounded by green vines did not know that the leaves were breathing something into the air that her body could not fight. The story is not a tragedy of villains. It is a tragedy of systems, of confidence, of the bright, blind momentum of progress. There is a coda, and it brings the story forward into our own time. Museum conservators who handle Victorian textiles and wallpapers today wear protective gloves and respirators. The green silk ball gowns, the artificial flower wreaths, the sample books of wallpaper patterns that survive in the drawers of the Victoria and Albert Museum and the Smithsonian still carry their original load of arsenic. They have been dangerous for over 150 years. The poison outlasted the women who wore the gowns, the children who played under the wreaths, the decorators who hung the paper. It is patient. It is permanent. It does not decay. It only waits for the right conditions, a little moisture, a little warmth, a little mold to breathe again. The rain has stopped outside the nursery window in the London terrace. The room is empty now. The children long since moved to drier air. The wallpaper stripped and replaced with something safe and pale. But if you were to peel back the layers, you would find it still there. A ghost of emerald green, a faint metallic garlic scent that rises when the plaster is damp. It is a document, not a decoration. It records, in its molecular structure, a moment when beauty and death were the same color. And it tells us, quietly, that the things we build to protect and comfort ourselves, the homes, the routines, the objects of daily life, are never merely what they seem. They are also the things that breathe beside us in the dark, with a chemistry we do not yet understand, with a patience we have never matched. The brass sprayer leans against the apple tree like a veteran too tired to stand, its nozzle still crusted with a pale, luminous green that has outlasted the hands that pumped it. The orchard around it is quiet. No beetle, no bird, no harvester. The fruit on the ground has softened into the leaf litter, and the unharvested apples above have taken on the deep, uncommercial red of neglect. But the stain on the machine is not neglect. It is a signature. Paris green, the name says. A color that once decorated ballrooms now decorates rusted agricultural metal, and the distance between those two destinations can be measured in human generations and in soil. The story of how arsenic entered the orchard properly begins not in a farm, but in a laboratory, or rather, on the long journey between a laboratory and the field. By 1867, Paris green had been brightening wallpaper, silk, and artificial flowers for decades when a farmer in the American Midwest looked at the brilliant copper arsenite powder and saw not pigment, but strategy. The Colorado potato beetle was devouring crops with the kind of thoroughness that makes a farmer superstitious. Traditional remedies, tobacco solutions, hand-picking, prayer were failing. And here was a substance already manufactured at scale, already distributed, already known to kill insects. The reasoning was practical, not chemical. The mechanism was understood only vaguely, in the same way one understands that a heavy object dropped on a beetle works. Application began. it spread. What happened next is recorded in agricultural bulletins and county fair ledgers, and in the sudden, sharp drop in beetle populations. Paris green mixed with water and sprayed across potato fields became the first large-scale insecticide deployment in modern agricultural history. The experiments were crude. Farmers adjusted ratios by eye, splashing the green suspension onto leaves with brooms, with watering cans, with anything that would carry liquid. The results were immediate. The potato beetle recoiled. The crop survived. The logic of chemical intervention, once proven, became irreversible. But Paris green was never a gentle tool. Copper arsenite is a stomach poison to insects, and it is a systemic poison to everything else. It adheres poorly to leaves, washing away in rain, and it damages the foliage itself at the concentrations required to kill pests. Farmers called it burning the plants. The solution was to spray more frequently. The solution was to mix it with other substances. The solution was never to stop using it, because the alternative was worse. The economic logic of the orchard and the field had already formed its alliance with the molecule, and that alliance would prove more durable than any safety objection. The sprayer leaning against the apple tree belongs to the second generation. By 1892, when lead arsenate entered commercial use, the science had grown more sophisticated and the consequences more permanent. Lead arsenate was an improvement in the language of efficacy. It clung to fruit and leaf with greater tenacity, resisted rain, and could be applied less often. It was less immediately damaging to the plant. It was also less reversible. Where Paris green left a seasonal residue, lead arsenate left a geological deposit. Sprayed in orchard after orchard across North America, it accumulated in the topsoil, bound to clay particles and organic matter, chemically stable, biologically patient. Apple trees absorbed it through their roots. Pears stored it in their skin. Cider presses crushed it into juice. The residue did not announce itself. It had no taste. It had no color. It had only a half-life measured in decades. The early 20th century inherited this accumulation without knowing it. In 1909, the United States Department of Agriculture began investigating reports of arsenic residues on commercial fruit. The findings were uncomfortable without being actionable. In 1926, British authorities seized American apples with arsenic levels that exceeded domestic tolerances, triggering a trade dispute that exposed the depth of the contamination. Public health officials found arsenic in the urine of consumers who had never handled pesticide, never visited an orchard, never done anything except eat. The word residue entered the regulatory vocabulary. The residue was not an accident. It was the intended mechanism, redirected downstream. The cider press became a focus of concern because it concentrated what the orchard had dispersed. A single pressing could gather the surface residues of hundreds of fruit, and the arsenic that had clung to an apple's redness did not vanish when the apple became liquid. Children drank it. Families stored it for winter. The dose was not acute. Nobody collapsed at the table. Nobody convulsed after dessert. The damage was cumulative, slow, distributed across years and across bodies, indistinguishable from other kinds of chronic decline until the epidemiological pattern became too large to ignore. This was the new shape of mass poisoning. Not a single teacup in a locked room, not a packet of white powder in an inheritance dispute, but a collective, ambient, legally tolerated ingestion administered by an industry that had never intended to harm. The paradox has deep roots and shallow recognition. The apple is, in the symbolic language of the culture that grew it, the fruit of health. "An apple a day," the proverb says in its older Scottish form, keeps the doctor away. The orchard is the site of pastoral simplicity, of agrarian virtue, of food that comes directly from the tree to the hand. And the poison was applied precisely to preserve that simplicity, to prevent the beetle from destroying the crop that embodied it. The farmer who coated his trees in lead arsenate was not a villain. He was a person solving a visible problem with the tools that science and industry had provided. Tools that carried invisible long-term costs no single farmer could assess. The cost was distributed to the consumer, who received it not as a warning, but as a meal. The soil remembers what the market forgets. Lead arsenate binds tightly to the ground. It was sprayed upon, and decades after the last application, former orchard land throughout the northeastern and midwestern United States still carries levels of arsenic and lead that exceed residential safety guidelines. The subdivisions built on old apple country, the school playgrounds on converted farmland, the garden plots where families grow tomatoes. These sites have inherited a decision made in 1905 by a grower who could not have imagined them. The poison did not go anywhere. It waited in the topsoil, beneath the grass, beneath the concrete, beneath the swing set, while the world reassembled itself above. Some of the contaminated land is mapped now, some of it is not. The apple trees are long gone, replaced by houses, by parking lots, by municipal parks. The brass sprayer in the abandoned orchard rusts further, losing its ghostly green stain to the weather. But the arsenic it deposited does not rust. It does not weather. It does not evaporate. It remains a slow, patient background condition, a chemical feature of the ground that a developer's soil test sometimes rediscovers and sometimes does not. What is strange is how quiet this inheritance has remained in the collective memory. The story of arsenic poisoning is usually told as a story of individuals, the murderess, the victim, the forensic chemist, the trial. The orchard story lacks a villain, lacks a dramatic scene, lacks a verdict. It is a story of infrastructure, of agricultural policy, of residue limits negotiated between trade partners, of parts per million measured in applesauce. It is a story written in memoranda rather than in confessions, and yet it affected more bodies than any single poisoning trial ever could. The arithmetic of the orchard is vast and anonymous. Millions of apples, millions of mouths, decades of exposure. No defendant, no sentence, only a gradual regulatory retreat that left the soil itself as the final plaintiff. The scientific mechanism is straightforward in hindsight. Arsenate ions mimic phosphate ions, which plants and animals require for energy metabolism. A plant root encountering an arsenate molecule mistakes it for the nutrient it resembles and draws it inside. A human digestive system does the same. Inside the body, the arsenate interferes with oxidative phosphorylation, the fundamental process by which cells generate energy, uncoupling the machinery of metabolism and causing slow, multi-system damage. Skin, nerves, liver, vascular system. The symptoms are diffuse, gradual, often misdiagnosed. The mechanism, though, is precise, a molecular imitation, a physiological forgery. The body accepts because the molecule has learned the chemical password. The poison is not violence. The poison is impersonation. This impersonation is what makes the orchard story so difficult to tell and so essential to repeat. There was no deception intended, and yet deception was the entire chemical basis of the injury. The arsenate did not attack. It resembled. It slipped in. and the institution that deployed it, modern agriculture, did so under the banner of protection, of abundance, of the new century's promise that science would feed the world. The Colorado potato beetle was a genuine threat. The Irish famine was living memory. The fear of crop loss was not irrational. The remedy was rational, available, and inadequately understood. The gap between understanding and application is where the tragedy lodged itself. And that gap is not unique to arsenic. It is the gap of every technology deployed at scale before its long-term behavior is known. The unharvested apples on the leaf-littered ground ought to be a warning, but warnings are only legible in retrospect. To the farmer who abandoned the sprayer, the fruit looked fine. To the cider maker who pressed it, the juice tasted clean. To the child who drank it, the afternoon remained ordinary. The danger was not hidden in the poison, it was hidden in the normal. The orchard becomes, in the long view, a kind of laboratory that no one meant to build. A field trial without consent forms, without ethics review, without control group. The data stream is still running. The soil samples taken a century later. The groundwater monitoring wells. The epidemiological surveys of communities built on former farmlands. These are the results of an experiment that began with a beetle and ended with an element that will outlast every institution that ever carried out the spraying. The brass sprayer, the agricultural extension bulletin, the cider bottle, all have decayed or been discarded. The arsenic remains exactly itself. The listener drifting through this story might close their eyes, let the wash of historical distance settle, and imagine the orchard as it was, the rows of trees in early summer, the hum of insects, the farmer walking with the heavy brass canister, the fine green mist settling onto the leaves. It looked like care. It was care in the only form the century had provided. The fact that care can carry consequences that outlast memory is not immoral. It is a property of complex systems. The molecule does not care what the farmer intended. The soil does not distinguish between poison and protection. The body does not register the difference between malice and accident. It only metabolizes. It only accumulates. It only keeps the record. The orchard is quiet now. The trees are untended, the fruit fallen, the season turning. The green stain on the brass is not a signal. It is only evidence. Somewhere beneath the grass, the arsenate ions are still bound to clay particles, still bearing their resemblance to phosphate, still waiting for a root that does not ask questions. The archive of the ground is patient. It has no index, no clerk, no retrieval request form. But it is still being read. Every soil core pulled from an old orchard plot, every lab report, every public health map. These are the footnotes to a chapter that has not finished being written. In the high-ceilinged courtroom, the light fell not from windows, but from gas lamps suspended on long brass chains, their flames shivering slightly each time the great oak doors opened and closed. It was January 1840, in the town of Toul, in the Corrèze department of France, and the air inside the chamber had thickened with the smell of wet wool, ink, and the soft, persistent rot of old timber. A clerk stood at a side table, holding a sealed exhibit bag. Inside the bag, separated from the world by a layer of waxed linen, rested a porcelain teacup and a folded paper of fine white powder. The paper bore a label in careful script: Mordox rats, rat poison. There was no smell from the bag, no visible stain on the cup, no tremor in the clerk's hands. And yet every person in the room understood that the contents of that bag had already rearranged the terms of inheritance inside a stone house in the village of Laglandier, and that the question before the court was not whether a man had died, but whether a taste of nothing could, in fact, be proven to exist. The dead man was Charles Lafarge, a sometime ironmaster whose business ventures had curdled into debt, and whose marriage to a young woman named Marie Capel had been arranged through a matrimonial agency with the brisk efficiency of a customs transaction. Marie had arrived at Laglandier in August 1839, carrying a trousseau of linen and a locked wooden casket that she kept in her private room. Within 5 months, Charles was dead, his body racked by vomiting, burning thirst, and a strange, leathery drying of the throat that the local doctor could not quite name. The diagnosis drifted from cholera to gastric fever to something the servants whispered about before the priest had even left the house. And then a family friend noticed that Marie was ordering arsenic from the local chemist, not once, but repeatedly, and that she had been stirring a white powder into her husband's broth with the same bland solicitude with which one adds salt to a pot au feu. The trial that followed did something no French courtroom had done before. It placed a piece of laboratory glassware at the center of a murder prosecution and asked the jury to believe that a chemical reaction could speak more truthfully than a human witness. The instrument was the Marsh test, devised only 4 years earlier by the British chemist James Marsh, and it worked by generating arsine gas from a suspect sample and then heating a glass tube to decompose the gas, depositing a characteristic metallic mirror of elemental arsenic at the far end. That tiny mirror, no larger than a thumbnail, dark as a winter puddle, became the star witness in the case against Marie Lafarge. The prosecution's experts, among them the celebrated toxicologist Mathieu Orfila, brought from Paris by express coach, testified that they had found arsenic in the exhumed viscera of Charles Lafarge, and that the mirror which bloomed inside their apparatus could not have come from the soil of the graveyard, the wood of the coffin, or the minerals of the body itself. It had to have come from a human hand. But this was not as simple as the experts made it sound. The very elegance of the Marsh test concealed a trap. Arsenic, you see, is not a rare substance that arrives in the world only when summoned by a murderer. It lives in the geology beneath our feet, dissolved into groundwater, suspended in the dust that settles on graveyard flowers, used as a preservative in the embalming fluids that undertakers poured into the cavities of the dead, and even present in the zinc that the Marsh test itself required to generate its hydrogen stream. A false positive could arise from contaminated reagents, from soil that had leached into a half-rotted coffin, from the tiny arsenic-rich particles that clung to the roots of plants, from the very nails that held the coffin boards together. The laboratory mirror was, in its own quiet way, as ambiguous as a human confession extracted under pressure, and the court in Toul knew it. Orfila's great authority carried the day, but the margin of doubt never fully evaporated. Marie Lafarge was convicted, sentenced to life, and eventually died in prison. But the real sentence handed down that winter was a question, not a verdict, and it echoed through every subsequent trial in the century. How do you convict a woman when the poison has no smell, no color, no taste? And the instrument designed to find it may be reading the signature of the earth itself? The question crossed the English Channel 15 years later and took up residence in a different kind of chamber, a Glasgow courtroom in 1855, where a young woman named Madeline Smith sat in the dock accused of murdering her secret lover, Pierre-Emile Langelier, with a cup of cocoa laced with arsenic. Madeline was 22, the daughter of a prosperous architect, and she had conducted a passionate correspondence with the Frenchman Langelier, a shipping clerk of modest means, while maintaining the public appearance of a respectable young woman on the brink of an advantageous marriage. The letters, later read aloud in court with the jury visibly squirming, left no doubt about the physical nature of the relationship, but the charge was not immorality. It was murder. Langelier had died in his lodgings after repeated bouts of severe gastric illness, and arsenic was found in his stomach. The prosecution claimed that Madeleine had purchased arsenic on 3 separate occasions from a local druggist, signing the poison register each time with the candid admission that she needed it for the rats, and that she had mixed it into the cocoa she prepared for Langelier on the night of his final illness. The trouble, once again, was the taste of nothing. Arsenic trioxide dissolves readily in a hot liquid, leaving behind no bitterness, no gritty residue, no change in the color of the beverage. The cocoa tasted exactly like cocoa. Langelier drank it, complained of a slight burning sensation, and was dead within days. But the physician who attended him had diagnosed gastric fever, and the arsenic in his body might, the defense argued, have come from a self-administered dose. Langelier had been known to take patent medicines, or from the environmental contamination that was, by the middle of the 19th century, already a silent feature of urban life. Green wallpaper, impure food dyes, adulterated glucose. The Victorian world was quietly steeped in the element it feared most, and that ubiquity now became Madeleine Smith's legal shield. If arsenic was everywhere, then its mere presence in a cadaver proved nothing. The prosecution could not demonstrate that she had placed it in the cup, only that she had bought it, and that he had died, and that the two facts touched each other in the dark. The Scottish jury returned the verdict of not proven, a peculiarly Caledonian judgment that sits in the space between innocence and acquittal, acknowledging that the state has failed to meet its burden of proof while also leaving a permanent smear of suspicion on the defendant. Madeleine Smith walked out of the High Court of Justiciary and into a life of quiet obscurity, eventually relocating to the United States under a new name. But the verdict itself remained behind, a ghost in the legal architecture, a reminder that the perfect poison created a perfect ambiguity. The tastelessness and invisibility that made arsenic the ideal murder weapon also made it indistinguishable from natural disease, from industrial accident, from the 1,000 quiet exposures of ordinary life. Every teacup became a potential exhibit, every packet of rat poison a hypothetical murder weapon, every grieving widow a possible assassin, and the justice system had no consistent method for sifting the intentional from the accidental. The atmospherics of the courtroom were part of the public imagination now. The porcelain teacup in its waxed bag, the folded paper with its damning label, the clerk who handled them as though they might exhale a visible curse. These objects became icons not because they proved anything, but because they concentrated a broader cultural anxiety into a single, graspable image. In the Toole courtroom, the teacup had been part of a domestic breakfast service, decorated with a pattern of faded roses that the local newspaper described as innocent in appearance. Its very ordinariness was the horror. It belonged to the same species of object that sat on every French kitchen dresser, the same white glazed vessel from which children drank their morning milk and grandmothers sipped their evening tisane. That it could harbor a lethal dose of an invisible substance without changing its appearance, its temperature, or the taste of its contents. That was the quiet revolution arsenic had brought to the architecture of murder. You did not need to be a Borgia, and Agrippina, a professional poisoner with a cabinet of exotic tinctures. You needed only a household vessel, a common rodenticide, and a pulse rate slow enough to stir. And the white powder itself, the mort ox rats folded into its paper packet, was equally banal. Arsenic trioxide had been sold freely in French and British pharmacies for much of the 19th century, often without a signature, sometimes without a label, a household staple for killing rats, mice, and the various small vermin that colonized the foundations of pre-modern houses. It was a substance that belonged in the public mind to the realm of domestic utility, not exotic crime. Its very cheapness and availability erased the threshold between the ordinary and the homicidal. The journalist covering the Lafarge trial noted that the packet introduced as evidence looked indistinguishable from the one lying in his own pantry, purchased the previous spring for a persistent mouse infestation. The frisson that ran through the courtroom was not the thrill of the exotic, but the chill of the intimately familiar. Behind both trials, and behind the thousands of similar cases that flickered through the assizes of Europe and America in those decades, lay a deeper tension that neither the Marsh test nor the rhetoric of lawyers could fully resolve. Chemistry had begun, for the first time in history, to enter the courtroom as a witness, speaking a language of precipitates and metallic mirrors that the jury was expected to understand and accept. But chemistry, like any witness, had its own history, its own biases, its own conditions of reliability. The Marsh test could detect arsenic at concentrations of a few micrograms, a sensitivity that seemed almost miraculous to the mid-century mind. But it could not distinguish between the arsenic that had been ingested during life and the arsenic that had entered the corpse from the soil of the graveyard. It could not tell whether the metal in the teacup had been placed there by a human hand or had leached invisibly from the green glaze of the porcelain itself, colored with copper arsenite to produce that desirable shade of apple blossom pink. The test could reveal the presence of arsenic, but it could not narrate the story of its arrival. That story remained a matter of human inference, and human inference is the domain of prejudice, eloquence, and the fragile theater of the courtroom. The paradox deepened with each passing decade. As forensic chemistry grew more sensitive, it uncovered arsenic in places that had never previously been suspected. In the wallpaper of the nursery, in the soil of the churchyard, in the sugar used to make peppermint lozenges, in the wax of cheap candles, in the dye of a green silk dress. The very ubiquity of the element meant that a positive Marsh test became, in certain contexts, less incriminating rather than more. A defense lawyer could now argue, with perfect scientific plausibility, that the arsenic found in his client's victim had come not from a murderous spouse, but from the damp walls of the bedroom, the adulterated beer, the cosmetic powder on the dressing table, the pesticide residue on an apple. The prosecution's mirror, that dark gleaming annulus at the end of the glass tube, had once seemed like a triumph of certainty over doubt. Now it looked, increasingly, like a trick of the light, an artifact of chemistry rather than a window into the soul. The courtroom itself acquired a new kind of furniture in these years, the exhibit table, that secular altar on which the relics of suspected murder were laid out for the jury's inspection. On the exhibit table in Toulay sat the teacup, the packet of powder, a sealed jar containing portions of Charles Lafarge's stomach, and the Marsh apparatus itself, dismantled into its component parts after the analysis. In Glasgow, the table held the cocoa cup, the letters, the druggist's poison register with Madeline Smith's signature repeated 3 times in a sloping, unhurried hand. These objects constituted a new form of testimony, a mute chorus of things that spoke only through the medium of the expert witness. The jury was asked to read the cup, the powder, the signature, the mirror, as though they were texts in a language that had been invented only a generation earlier. And the language was slippery. It contained false cognates. It was full of words whose meanings shifted with the humidity of the room. What does it mean, after all, to label a folded paper rat poison? The phrase is a confession of intent, but whose intent? The druggist sold the arsenic for the purpose of killing vermin. The purchaser may have intended the same, but the label cannot testify to the presence of a second, unspoken intention that took shape only after the packet left the shop. The paper itself is indifferent. It carries the powder without comment. Its fold lines record only the mechanical pressure of the hand that sealed it. And yet, in the charged atmosphere of a murder trial, the label becomes a kind of involuntary confession, a written admission that the defendant possessed a lethal substance in the days before the death. The word rat begins to vibrate with metaphorical possibility. The jury cannot unsee it. Marie Lafarge's conviction and Madeline Smith's ambiguous release were not simply verdicts on two women. They were the endpoints of a long, slow collision between the ancient art of poisoning and the emerging discipline of analytical chemistry, a collision that left both sides damaged and neither side fully victorious. The poisoner's advantage had always been the invisibility of her weapon. The chemist's advantage was the growing capacity to render the invisible visible. But the translation was never perfect. Something was always lost in the glass tube: a context, a timeline, a chain of custody, a motive. The mirror reflected the poison, but not the hand. The law required a hand, a will, a mens rea, and the Marsh test could offer only a molecular ghost. And so the taste of nothing in a teacup became a permanent feature of the modern legal imagination, a standing provocation to the faith that science can finally, unambiguously, separate the guilty from the innocent. The 19th century had invented the forensic laboratory, but it had not yet invented the protocols, the controls, the chain of evidence standards, the environmental baseline studies that would eventually stabilize the meaning of a positive test. What it had instead was a kind of prolonged, anxious negotiation between the bench and the benchtop, between the judge's robes and the chemist's pipette. Every arsenic trial was, in this sense, a trial of chemistry itself, a test of whether the new science could bear the weight of a capital sentence without cracking under pressure. And the answer, in those mid-century decades, was a deeply equivocal yes. The high-ceilinged courtroom of Thule has long since been demolished. The clerk who held the sealed exhibit bag is anonymous, his name unrecorded in the court annals. The porcelain teacup has vanished into some closed archive or been destroyed, its rose pattern faded beyond recognition. The folded paper of white powder, if it survived, rests in a temperature-controlled drawer in a museum of legal medicine, its fibers slowly yellowing, its label still legible under glass. But the problem they embodied has never been fully archived. It reappears whenever a forensic test introduces a new kind of ambiguity into the justice system, whenever a jury is asked to weigh the authority of a laboratory against the unreliability of human memory, whenever a molecule enters the courtroom and declares its presence, but not its provenance. The taste of nothing is still, in its way, on trial, and the verdict has never been securely returned. The clerk, if he could speak, might tell us this: the bag was sealed, the evidence was logged, the court rose and went to dinner, and the arsenic, as it always does, waited quietly for the next teacup. There is a particular quiet that settles over a laboratory after midnight, when the gas lights have been turned down to a low hiss, and the only bright point in the room is a single flame burning under a glass tube. The tube is thin, bent at precise angles, and inside it a stain is forming, not a liquid, not a powder, but a deposit so thin it reflects the flame back as a dark metallic glint. It looks like a sliver of mirror that someone breathed onto the glass. A chemist standing in his shirt sleeves at a mahogany bench watches the stain spread, and he knows that he is no longer looking at a sample of coffee, a scrap of wallpaper, a teaspoon of stomach contents. He is looking at arsenic, made visible for the first time as indisputable physical evidence. The year is 1836, and the man is James Marsh, a tall, silent ordnance chemist at the Royal Arsenal in Woolwich. He has just built a machine that will transform the way the law thinks about murder. He has also built a machine that will, before very long, learn to lie. Marsh did not set out to revolutionize forensic toxicology. He was called as an expert witness in a local poisoning case, asked to demonstrate the presence of arsenic in a sample taken from a suspected victim. The standard test of the day was an old, unreliable procedure. You mixed the suspect material with sulfuric acid and zinc, ignited the gas that bubbled off, and held a cold porcelain plate in the flame. If a dark stain formed, it suggested arsenic. Marsh performed the test, obtained a clear positive result, and watched the jury acquit the defendant anyway. The stain had faded before the trial, a week in open air, and the forensic proof had evaporated like a rumor. The accused walked free, and Marsh walked back to the arsenal, a different man. The problem was not chemistry. The problem was persuasion. What Marsh built over the following months was a device of extraordinary elegance. It began with a glass vessel containing zinc and sulfuric acid. A sample, tissue, vomit, tea, wine, a suspicious powder from a locked drawer was introduced through a stoppered funnel. If arsenic was present, a reaction produced arsine gas, a colorless, flammable vapor with a faint smell of garlic, a gas that would kill a laboratory worker in a closed room, but that, when channeled through a narrow glass tube and heated with a spirit flame, broke apart at a known temperature. The arsenic, separated from its hydrogen carrier, deposited itself as a metallic mirror just beyond the heated zone. The mirror was black in thin layers, a deep chocolate brown when thicker, and it could be weighed, measured, photographed, produced in court. It did not fade. It did not evaporate. It was the corpse of the poison, rebuilt in glass. No other forensic instrument had ever done anything quite like it. The Marsh test could find arsenic in a single drop of fluid, in a few strands of hair, in the scrapings from under a fingernail. It turned absence into presence, the tasteless and odorless into a shining physical signature that a judge could see with his own eyes. Within a decade, the apparatus had been adopted by toxicologists from Paris to Philadelphia, and the era of the perfect poison began to close. Marie Lafarge, tried in 1840, was convicted because the Marsh test found arsenic in the exhumed remains of her husband, even after the body had been buried for months. The invisible inheritance powder became a dark gleam at the end of a glass tube, and the chemistry of murder seemed at last to have found its counter-chemistry. But the mirror had a second nature, one that took longer to understand. Arsenic is not a rare element. It exists in soils, in clays, in the iron of coffin nails, in the groundwater that seeps into a grave after every rain, in the embalming fluids that undertakers were beginning to use. in the very dust that settled on the exhumation table. When a body is lifted from the earth after 6 months or 6 years, the question is no longer simply whether arsenic is present, but whose arsenic it is. The Marsh test was exquisitely sensitive. It could detect quantities as small as 1,000th of a grain. It could not, however, distinguish between the arsenic a poisoner had stirred into a cup of cocoa and the arsenic that had slowly entered a buried corpse from the soil in which it lay. The bright mirror in the tube was chemically identical in both cases. The difference was only a story the glass could not tell. Exhumations became treacherous evidence. A positive Marsh test could damn a widow while a negative one could acquit her, but the truth was foggier than the gaslight in the laboratory. Contamination was everywhere. Chemists found that the sulfuric acid and zinc they used might themselves contain traces of arsenic, requiring blank tests before every examination. The soil around a cemetery might be naturally rich in arsenic from geological formations. Coffin nails, painted against rust, often contained arsenical pigments. Even the glassware, if not scrupulously cleaned, could hold a memory of a previous experiment. Every step of the chain required a skepticism that the early enthusiasts for the test had not imagined. The machine that made the invisible visible now had to be protected from its own excessive trustworthiness. It saw too much, and too indiscriminately. The paradox was this: the very instrument designed to end ambiguity created a new, deeper ambiguity. Before the Marsh test, a poisoning was a mystery of symptoms: vomiting, diarrhea, a slow collapse that looked like cholera or gastric fever. After the Marsh test, a poisoning was a mirror in a tube, and that mirror seemed to offer certainty, but it also manufactured guilt from the very ground of the graveyard. A man could be hanged because the soil in which his wife was buried happened to contain arsenic from a long-forgotten orchard spray, from a nearby smelter, from the natural erosion of arsenopyrite rock. The line between murder and geology had never been thinner, and the courts were not equipped to trace it. The strange part was not that the Marsh test could be fooled, but that everyone wanted so badly for it to be infallible. The Victorian public, devouring newspaper accounts of poisoning trials, had found a hero in the new forensic chemistry. They wanted the poisoner to be caught, the widow to be sentenced, the invisible to be dragged into the light. The mirror in the tube became a cultural object as much as a scientific one, a tiny gleaming witness that could speak when the corpse had fallen silent. But a witness is not always truthful, and the chemical witness, unlike a human one, could not be cross-examined. It answered only one question: is arsenic here? It could not answer the question that mattered more: how did it get here, and whose hand delivered it? The Bradford Sweets poisoning of 1858 showed that the question was even harder than the grave had made it seem. It was not quite a murder case, and yet it contained all the elements of murder: a sudden, inexplicable wave of death, a sweet taste, a public panic, and a laboratory full of glass tubes reflecting thin metallic mirrors. The story began in a confectioner's shop in the Yorkshire town of Bradford, where a man named William Hardaker sold peppermint lozenges from a stall in the Green Market. The lozenges were cheap, a penny for an ounce, and they were made by a local sweet maker, Joseph Neal, who had run low on sugar and sent a boy to borrow a supply from a neighboring druggist. The druggist, Charles Hodgson, was ill in bed, and his assistant, a young man named William Goddard, reached for a cask in the back of the shop. He believed it contained sugar. It contained 12 pounds of arsenic trioxide, a substance indistinguishable from powdered sugar to the eye, and, in the darkness of the storeroom, to the touch. The mistake was not discovered until the lozenges had been made, stamped with peppermint oil to mask the faintly metallic taste, and distributed to the market. Within hours, the buyers began to fall ill. The first deaths came that night. By the time the outbreak subsided, 21 people were dead, many of them children, and more than 200 were suffering from acute arsenic poisoning. The symptoms were brutal but indistinguishable from severe gastric disease, burning pain, retching, a rapid pulse that thinned and slowed. The local doctor, John Henry Bell, noticed the pattern. All the victims had bought lozenges from the same stall. He collected samples, dispatched them to a chemist in Leeds, and the Marsh test duly returned its verdict. The lozenges were saturated with arsenic, each one containing enough to kill several people. The Bradford case was not a trial of a human poisoner, but it was a kind of trial nonetheless. A trial of the industrial landscape that had made arsenic so casually available that it could be mistaken for sugar by a harried assistant in a dim shop. The Marsh test did its work with precision, tracing the poison through the sugar, through the lozenges, through the stomachs of the dead, and all the way back to the mislabeled cask. Yet the very success of the test raised a chilling question. If 21 people could die from a single mistake in a single market town, how many other deaths, scattered across the country and recorded as cholera, gastritis, or simple failure of the heart, had been caused by the same substance without anyone ever suspecting? The mirror could only reflect what was put before it. It could not go looking for the unexamined teaspoon, the forgotten jar, the wallpaper peeling in a damp nursery. The Bradford tragedy demonstrated something else, something that toxicologists had been reluctant to admit. The Marsh test had been designed to catch murderers, to pin a single, deliberate act of poisoning onto a single pair of hands. But the industrial world had turned arsenic into an ambient presence, a substance that leaked into food, air, water, clothing, toys, and wallpaper without any human malice at all. The distinction between a crime and an accident was becoming chemically invisible. A Marsh test performed on the liver of a Bradford victim produced the same kind of metallic mirror as a test performed on the exhumed organs of a suspected poisoning in a Scottish manor house. The arsenic did not care whether it had arrived via a peppermint lozenge or a wife's steady hand over several months. The mirror was indifferent. That indifference was the true shock of 19th century forensic chemistry. The instrument that made the invisible visible was also the instrument that made the moral world illegible. Intent, the central pillar of criminal law, refused to precipitate inside a glass tube. The courts could see the arsenic. They could weigh it. They could photograph it. They could not, however, deduce from its glittering surface whether it represented a murder, a blunder, or a geological inheritance. The graveyard gave up its dead, and the dead gave up their secrets. But the secret often turned out to be that the earth itself was a slow, distributed accomplice to a crime nobody had committed. Years later, a toxicologist writing in a medical journal would note that a false positive from a Marsh test had nearly sent a young widow to the gallows, until a more careful investigator measured the arsenic content of the soil around her husband's coffin and found it higher than the arsenic content in his stomach lining. The dead man had not been poisoned. He had been entombed in a geological deposit. The mirror had faithfully reported the presence of the metal, but it had lied about everything else. It had lied about the story, the agency, the guilt. It had performed its chemistry with perfect fidelity and delivered a perfectly ambiguous result. If you were to stand in a Victorian laboratory late at night, with the gaslight throwing long shadows across the bench, you might see the apparatus still set up from the day's work. A flask, a flame, a thin glass tube stained dark. You might lean close enough to catch a faint scent that is not quite garlic, not quite metal, not quite decay. You might see the tiny mirror glinting inside the tube, and for a moment, you might think you were looking at truth. But if you looked longer, you would see only a reflection of the room and of yourself and of the unanswerable distance between proof and justice. The archive drawer, when it opens, exhales that same faint scent. The wallpaper sample, the lace glove, the soil vial, all of them emit a chemical whisper that asks not who did it, but what, in the end, did not. The apothecary drawer still smells of beeswax and something sharper, a mineral ghost that lingers in the grain of old wood. On a marble counter, 2 bottles sit in the amber light of a late London afternoon. The first is a squat pharmacy jar, its label handwritten in sepia iron gall ink, arsenic, colored. Inside, a heap of crystalline powder shimmers with the dull, bruised tint of indigo dye, as if someone ground a twilight sky into salt. The second bottle is taller, thinner, a transparent medical vial with a ground glass stopper containing a liquid so clear it could be distilled rainwater. Its label reads, Liquor Potassii, Arsenitis, Fowler Solution. No dye, no bitter warning, no color at all. The law, it seems, had written 2 different texts with the same ink and entrusted them both to the same hand. This is the paradox that settled into English law in the summer of 1851, and it would not be dislodged for a century. Parliament, having finally been convinced that arsenic was the invisible accomplice in too many unexplained deaths, passed an act to regulate the sale of arsenic. The statute demanded that any arsenic sold to the public must be mixed with soot or indigo and combined with something bitter, usually aloe or quassia chips, so that no one could slip it unnoticed into a teacup. The poisoner's perfume, once tasteless and odorless, was to wear a visible, repellent mask. On the surface, it was a triumph of forensic prevention, a legislative mirror held up to the Marsh test's metallic gleam. But the law was a door that swung on a deliberate hinge. It exempted all sales for medicine, agriculture, and industry. Physicians, chemical manufacturers, and farmers could purchase white arsenic as pure as the day it was sublimed. No color, no taste, no questions. The murder weapon was only dyed blue for people who did not hold a prescription pad or a business ledger. The parliamentary debates leading to the act reveal a quiet struggle between public fear and commercial convenience. Coroners had been testifying for years about the ease with which anyone could walk into a druggist's shop and buy a pennyworth of white arsenic for rats or for a spouse. The press had made the Marsh test a household curiosity, and juries were beginning to understand that a metallic mirror in a glass tube could send a person to the gallows. Yet the chemical trades lobbied hard. The dye works needed arsenic for pigments. The glassmakers needed it for decolorizing. The calico printers consumed it by the barrel for printing patterns. And physicians, guardians of the healing art, insisted that arsenical preparations were indispensable remedies for fever, skin complaints, neuralgia, and the curious wasting condition they called chlorosis. To color the medicine would be to insult the patient and confuse the dosage. To add a bitter agent would make it intolerable to the stomach. And so the act, when it emerged from committee, had taken the form of a compromise. It regulated the domestic poison, but protected the institutional one. It made arsenic conspicuous in the marketplace, but invisible in the surgery. The druggist's apprentice who filled those 2 bottles on a wet November afternoon would have seen no contradiction. He had been taught that the colored powder was a dangerous commodity, to be sold only to a known person who signed the poison register with a witness present, its indigo stain a legal signature. The clear Fowler's solution, by contrast, was a therapeutic, a carefully titrated dose of potassium arsenite dissolved in distilled water and flavored with lavender or tincture of camphor to disguise its mineral tang. He would hand it over a counter without recording the buyer's name, just as he handed out laudanum or mercury ointment. The indigo bottle was a prisoner of the law. The clear bottle was a free citizen of the pharmacopoeia. And yet both held the same element, the same atomic capacity to interrupt cellular respiration, to replace phosphate in the molecular machinery of the mitochondrion, to stop the heart muscle's rhythm as neatly as a watchmaker removing a gear. The strange part was not that this double standard existed, but that nobody at the time could agree on where the boundary of legitimate use actually lay. Victorian medical journals are filled with articles extolling Fowler's solution as a tonic for everything from asthma to malaria, from chorea to syphilis, from the vague nervous exhaustion of middle-aged bankers to the lethargy of overworked schoolgirls. A dose of 3 to 5 drops 3 times a day gradually increased until the delicate warning signs appeared. Slight puffiness of the eyelids, a metallic taste on the tongue, a prickling in the fingers, and then held at that threshold. The poison was being calibrated against the body's own alarm bells, a titration of toxicity that would be considered reckless in a laboratory but was, in a clinic, simply called experience. The physician's prescription never asked whether the patient might, in some invisible way, be accumulating a debt that the body would one day have to pay. The symptom looked like recovery, until the ledger of cumulative exposure was balanced with a sudden, unexplained collapse. One of the most unsettling documents from this era is a small pamphlet published in 1871 by a provincial doctor who had treated over 200 cases of intermittent fever with Fowler's solution. He reported success rates that would make a modern physician envious. But his case notes are littered with asides. The patient's complexion improved remarkably, though she complained of a persistent chill. The child's appetite returned, yet the mother noted a strange darkness under the eyes. The gentleman felt so well he doubled the dose on his own initiative, and was found dead in his library without a mark upon him. The doctor himself remained a firm advocate of arsenic until the end of his career, attributing the deaths to idiosyncrasy, not to any predictable action of the drug. He saw what he wanted to see, a medicine that worked, not a poison that accumulated. The margin between the two was written in ink that faded the moment the prescription was filed. And then, in the early years of the 20th century, came the moment when arsenic's medical double identity reached its apotheosis. In 1910, the German physician and chemist Paul Ehrlich, after years of systematically testing hundreds of organic arsenic compounds, announced the discovery of salvarsan, an arsenic-based drug that could cure syphilis, the great incurable disease that had haunted Europe for 4 centuries. He called it a magic bullet, a chemical projectile that could seek out and destroy the spiral-shaped spirochete without damaging the body's own tissues. The world celebrated. Newspapers printed diagrams of the molecule. Patients lined up at hospitals to receive the intramuscular injection, a bright yellow liquid that stained the skin and left a metallic taste in the mouth that lasted for days. Salvarsan was not a subtle tonic like Fowler's solution. It was aggressive, industrial medicine, a direct application of chemical warfare to the microscopic battlefield of the bloodstream. And It worked, partially, imperfectly, sometimes with horrific side effects, but it worked well enough to transform the treatment of an entire disease and to cement the idea that a poison could also be a savior. Ehrlich's own notebooks reveal the extraordinary care with which he navigated the toxic threshold. Salvarsan had to be administered with precise attention to dose, body weight, and the preparatory fasting of the patient, because a slight excess could cause jaundice, convulsions, or sudden death. The preparation had to be dissolved in a specific alkaline solution just before injection, otherwise, the acidic compound would destroy the vein. It was a ritual of chemical precision, a liturgical performance in which the priest-physician stood at an altar of syringes and ampoules, balancing on the edge of therapeutic catastrophe. Yet for all its danger, Salvarsan was not regulated like the indigo-colored rat poison on the druggist's shelf. It was a prescription drug, exempt from the coloring laws, exempt from the bitter admixture, exempt from the poison register that still tracked every ounce of dyed arsenic sold to the public. The magic bullet wore no warning color. It arrived in a clear glass ampoule, the color of a diluted sunset, a miracle wearing the quiet, unmarked face of a toxic inheritance. The documentation of Salvarsan's use across Europe and America reveals a medical establishment that increasingly understood the phenomenon of delayed toxicity, the way arsenic could linger in the liver, the kidneys, the bones, for months after the last injection, and yet chose to treat that knowledge as a footnote. In the great syphilis clinics of Berlin and Paris, physicians kept double ledgers, one for the cure, tallying the disappearance of lesions and the conversion of positive blood tests to negative, and another, less public ledger, recording the cases of encephalitis, the liver failures, the sudden collapses during the third or fourth injection. The cure was visible, the cost was deferred. This was not deceit, so much as a kind of institutional patience, a belief that the long-term debts could be managed later, or perhaps simply a hope that the patient would move on to another clinic, another city, another country, and the ledger would not follow. The arsenic molecule had no opinion on the matter. It simply bound to the sulfhydryl groups of enzymes, one protein at a time, indifferent to whether the body it inhabited belonged to a murderer's victim or a cured syphilitic. In the end, the Arsenic Act of 1851 and its medical exemptions created more than a loophole. They created a cultural habit. By painting the domestic poison blue, the law satisfied the public demand for visible safety without disturbing the invisible flows of industry and medicine. The indigo bottle sat on the shelf as a symbol of state vigilance, a small monument to the idea that danger could be colored, labeled, and controlled. The clear bottle, Fowler's solution, and its pharmaceutical descendants continued to circulate through the bodies of patients who never knew they were drinking a poison that Parliament itself had deemed too dangerous to be sold without a dye. The two bottles, side by side in a London pharmacy under gaslight, are a portrait of a civilization that believed it could partition the elemental world into separate ethical categories: arsenic for murder, arsenic for industry, arsenic for healing. The molecule did not respect the partition. It moved freely from one bottle to another, one body to another, one century to another, dissolving boundaries as easily as it dissolved in a glass of water. The laboratory apparatus of the period makes the same point silently. In one corner of the apothecary, a Marsh test kit sits on a mahogany bench, its glass tube stained from years of use, a small metallic mirror of arsenic deposited on the inner surface of the porcelain nozzle. That mirror was the ultimate witness, the forensic proof that had convicted poisoners and exonerated the innocent. But the same bench also holds a set of graduated droppers for Fowler's solution, a prescription ledger, and a wooden rack of Salvarsan ampoules. The tools of detection and the tools of administration shared the same countertop, the same air tainted with the faint garlic hint of trimethylarsine. The law had drawn a line through the poison, but the line was permeable, osmotic, a membrane through which arsenic passed in both directions, from the colored bottle to the clear one, from the murderer's tea to the patient's vein. And so the archive drawer, when it finally exhales the dust of the Victorian era, does not reveal a simple story of a poison tamed. It reveals a treaty signed in half measures. The Arsenic Act was a political performance that calmed a frightened public while leaving the great reservoirs of white arsenic untouched. It acknowledged the element's lethal elegance without disrupting the industries and professions that depended on its colorless efficiency. The indigo bottle was a concession to spectacle. The clear vial was a concession to power. And the body, which kept its own meticulous books, registered every milligram without caring whether it arrived under a prescription, a pesticide, or a criminal intent. The poison had been painted blue for those who bought it in a hardware shop, but it remained pure as water for those who held a medical license, an industrial patent, or a government contract. This double standard did not die with the Victorian age. It merely went underground, learned to speak the language of progress, and waited for the next century to reveal what a substance perfected at hiding in plain sight could do when it dissolved into the global water supply, invisible and undressed, with no indigo to warn the thirsty. The first thing a child does after climbing onto a deck is touch the railing, and then, inevitably, touch her mouth. It is a gesture so small it exists below the threshold of parental alarm, a quiet transfer of whatever the hand has collected: dust, pollen, the invisible residues of a sun-warmed afternoon. For most of the late 20th century, that railing was likely pressure-treated timber, infused under factory conditions with a chemical cocktail designed to defeat rot, fungus, and the appetites of insects. The formula carried the trade name CCA, chromated copper arsenate. Copper to kill the microbes, chromium to bind the brew into the wood fiber, and arsenic, trivalent, chelated, insatiably toxic, to stop any creature that thought of eating the frame of the house. The wood was greenish when new, a faint spectral cousin of Paris green, and it sold by the millions of board feet across North America, Europe, and Australia. Playgrounds were built from it, picnic tables, garden beds. The quiet architecture of childhood was, in large part, a lumberyard of arsenic. Nobody disputed the effectiveness. The treated wood resisted termites, carpenter ants, fungal decay. It promised decades of service. What took longer to understand was the slow, silent exhalation of the poison back into the world it was meant to defend. Rainwater, slightly acidic from atmospheric carbon dioxide, scoured the surface of the boards. Ultraviolet light cracked the lignin. Children's hands, soft, warm, often damp, drew the mobile fraction of arsenic out of the wood by simple contact. The science was not obscure. Arsenic does not form a permanent covalent bond with cellulose. It sits in the matrix, held by electrostatic forces and the chromium's cross-linking, but it weathers and wears. By the early 2000s, studies from the U.S. Consumer Product Safety Commission and academic toxicologists had established a clear chain of evidence, from board to hand, from hand to mouth, and finally to urine samples that carried a distinct, measurable signature of inorganic arsenic. A 2003 study of families with CCA-treated playsets found that children who played on those structures had significantly higher urinary arsenic than unexposed peers. The playground had become a low-dose exposure site. The deck where families grilled hamburgers and held birthday parties was, in metabolic terms, a slow-bleeding vial of aqua tofana, diluted across an afternoon. The strange part was not that the wood was toxic. Industry warning labels had long advised against burning the wood or using it for cutting surfaces, but that we had taken a substance refined by Renaissance poisoners for the quiet dissolution of inconvenient individuals and used it to build the furniture of everyday life. Arsenic, that veteran of subtle eliminations, had been invited into the garden. And it stayed there, leaching into the soil beneath the swing set, accumulating in the vegetables planted in raised beds made of treated timber, teaching carrots and lettuce, the chemical grammar of Egyptian tomb decoration. The hand-to-mouth pathway was the same route by which a Roman emperor met his end, but now it operated at the scale of entire suburban populations. The poison had democratized without a manifesto. No one had to grind the powder into a cup of wine. The wood did the work, year after year, while children grew and their bones incorporated the heavy atom in place of phosphate. But the deck and the playground were only the shallowest well. To understand the deeper well, the one that reaches into the lives of tens of millions of people, you must travel halfway around the world and decades earlier, to a time when the color of the water meant life, not death. In the 1970s, the surface waters of Bangladesh, the ponds, the rivers, the shallow open wells were teeming with pathogens: cholera, dysentery, typhoid, the old killers that thrive in a warm, wet delta dense with human and animal waste. International agencies, led by UNICEF and the World Bank, engineered a massive public health intervention. The solution was elegant: drill tube wells, line them with cheap PVC pipe, tap the clear groundwater deep below the biologically contaminated surface layer. Millions of wells were sunk by hand, sometimes several in a single village, their bright painted hand pumps rising above the floodplain like colorful metal flowers. The water that came out was cool, odorless, and, most critically, free of the bacteria that had stolen children in the night. By the early 1990s, Bangladesh had become a landscape of pumps. Infant mortality from waterborne disease dropped sharply. It was, by every visible measure, a tremendous humanitarian success. The invisible measure took a generation to surface. The Ganges-Brahmaputra Delta is a gigantic geological sump, carrying sediment eroded from the Himalayan uplift over millions of years. Those sediments are rich in iron oxyhydroxides, and clinging to the iron in a thin chemical film is arsenic. It has been there since the mountains rose, an ancient dowry of the element that once gilded the eye paint of Egyptian queens. In the oxygen-rich surface waters, arsenic remains bound to the iron, insoluble and immobile. But the deep aquifers of the delta are starved of oxygen. They are a reducing environment where microbes breathe the rust itself, dissolving the iron and releasing whatever was attached. The arsenic slips into solution, an invisible, tasteless, colorless passenger in the very water that the well pumps to the surface. The water looks clear as glass. It tastes slightly sweet, perhaps, a faint, pleasant note. And it carries, dissolved in each liter, from 50 to over 1,000 micrograms of inorganic arsenic, levels that far exceed the World Health Organization's provisional guideline of 10 micrograms per liter. A person drinking that water every day is not poisoned in the acute sense of Locusta's potions. They are slowly, cumulatively mineralized, their tissues absorbing a metal that interferes with DNA repair, cellular respiration, and the quiet housekeeping of the epithelium. The first signs, when they came, were misinterpreted. Farmers in rural villages developed dark, raindrop-shaped spots on their palms and soles, then thickened, cracked patches of skin that defied herbal remedies. Doctors initially suspected a new fungal disease, or leprosy, or a mysterious dermatosis of tropical origin. But the lesions were pathognomonic. They were the hallmark of chronic arsenicosis, a condition last widely studied in the days of Styrian peasants who ate arsenic for their complexions and in the factory workers of the Paris Green era. By the mid-1990s, a rising tide of patients with melanosis, hyperkeratosis, and unusual internal cancers overwhelmed district hospitals. The connection was finally articulated. The wells were the source. In 1998, the World Bank and the World Health Organization convened an emergency conference after a field survey revealed that nearly a third of the country's tube wells delivered water above the national arsenic limit, and millions exceeded it by a factor of 10 or more. The number of exposed individuals was estimated at 35 to 77 million, out of a population then around 130 million. The largest mass poisoning in recorded history had been administered not by a tyrant, not by a corporation with a smoking gun, but by the geology of the earth itself, unlocked by a good intention. The tube well, that savior of children, had become the primary vector of an epidemic that took 20 years to reveal its face. The discovery rippled outward in the early 2000s. Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, the same Holocene aquifers flanking the Himalayan uplift revealed identical chemistry. Wells tested in the Red River Delta and the Mekong Basin produced arsenic concentrations that mirrored Bangladesh. In Argentina, the Chaco-Pampean Plain had been delivering arsenic-laced groundwater to rural communities for generations, the cause of a regional chronic disease known historically as Belleville disease. In the United States, private wells in the Central Valley of California, in Arizona, in the Ogallala Aquifer under Nebraska, in pockets of New England, were found to exceed federal standards, a fragmented mosaic of risk that rarely seized national attention because the exposure was scattered across counties, not concentrated in a single photogenic crisis zone. The perfect poison had not conquered the world through malice. It had simply dissolved into the planetary water table, a geological fact waiting to be activated by a pump handle. The same benign invisibility that once allowed a widow to mix Mana di San Nicola into her husband's broth now permitted a mother to fill her child's glass with clear, cold water that carried a sentence of cancer written in parts per billion. The poisoner's perfume had no bottle, no label, no Florentine glass vial. Its bottle was the aquifer. Its label was a reassuring government test for bacteria, negative, safe, drink. What does it mean to be poisoned without a poisoner? The question hangs in the humid air of a Bengali village where the hand pump stands patiently on its concrete plinth, the iron handle burnished by a million daily repetitions. It is a question that resists the familiar courtroom narrative. There is no accused in the dock, no inheritance at stake, no teacup to seal in an evidence bag. Responsibility is distributed across the sediments of the Himalayas, the dissolved organic matter that feeds microbes. The international lending policies that prioritized rapid well construction without concurrent, widespread water quality testing, and the simple, irreducible fact that arsenic is a common resident of the continental crust. The village elder who proudly installed the pump with his own hands could not have known Knowledge requires analytical chemistry that arrived years too late and still cannot reach every household. The aid worker who turned the first tap and tasted the clear water did not know, because the water was clean of cholera, and that was the only enemy they had been sent to fight. The tragedy is not one of hidden malice, but of profound systemic blind spots, a public health solution that solved one problem while unknowingly creating a slower, more insidious one. The paradox of this chapter is that the very attribute that made arsenic the perfect murder weapon, its undetectability in food and drink, also made it the perfect epidemiological blind spot. You cannot see it. You cannot taste it. You can only measure it with a spectrometer or wait for the body to tally its debt. The body keeps its own ledgers, and in the villages of Bangladesh, the entries are written on skin, melanokeratosis on palms and soles, the dark modeling of the chest, the slowly swelling liver and fibrotic lungs. These are the records of a chronicle that spans decades. They record every glass of water, every pot of rice cooked in that water, every breath of steam from the boiling pot that carried a microdose of volatile arsenic. Unlike a bacterial infection, which announces itself with fever and pain within days, arsenic's work is geological in its patience. It substitutes for phosphorus in the body's metabolic machinery, jamming the gears of ATP production. It binds to sulfhydryl groups in proteins, inactivating enzymes that repair DNA, that regulate cell division. The cancers that emerge, lung, bladder, liver, skin, are the final paragraphs of a silent narrative that began in the Cretaceous rocks that trapped the arsenic in their ferruginous embrace. Evolution never needed to build a sensory alarm for this. The bioavailable arsenic in most surface environments was too low to matter until we drilled into the reducing aquifers and changed the redox state of a continent. The social body, too, keeps a ledger. In rural Bangladesh, the visible skin lesions of arsenicosis carry a heavy stigma. Women with keratosis are often ostracized, their daughters considered unmarriageable. The disease is sometimes mistaken for leprosy, leading to social exclusion. A farmer who can no longer work because of painful hyperkeratosis loses his livelihood before he loses his life. The slow epidemic does not just poison cells, it poisons the fabric of community, the intricate web of marriage, labor, and inheritance. This is the democratic death that no one voted for. It does not discriminate by caste or creed. It only discriminates by geography, by the unlucky accident of living above a shallow aquifer rich in iron and old arsenic. Yet, like so many environmental injustices, the burden falls heaviest on those with the fewest resources to mitigate it. Deep wells to safer aquifers, household filtration systems, and piped water supplies cost money and political will. The arsenic crisis remains, in many regions, a crisis of poverty and governance as much as of geology. The treated wood of the suburban playground and the tube well of the rural delta are not separate stories. They are two manifestations of the same long arc that leads from the alchemist's white powder to the infrastructure of modernity. In both cases, arsenic was chosen for its useful toxicity, to kill beetles, to kill rot, to kill bacteria, and in both cases, its persistence outran its purpose. The wood continues to leach arsenic into soil decades after installation. The well continues to pump arsenic until the aquifer is flushed by clean recharge, a process that operates on a timescale of centuries. The children who climbed on CCA decks in the 1990s are now adults, and the arsenic they absorbed is stitched into the record of their bones and hair. The Bangladeshi farmers who drank from tube wells in the 1980s have since passed into epidemiological datasets that trace the upward curve of lung and bladder cancer incidence. A voluntary industry phase out of CCA for residential use in the United States in 2004 stopped the installation of new playgrounds, but the existing structures remain, their wood aging, leaching, slowly relinquishing its toxic heritage. In Bangladesh, millions still drink from contaminated wells because there is no alternative source within a walking distance. The poison has become ambient, a permanent background condition of modern life, a vestigial echo of green wallpaper in a St. Helena prison, of arsenical face powder in a Renaissance boudoir, of pesticide mist that settled on the skin of a perfect apple. The deep well of the forgotten epidemic is, in the end, a well of memory. The water remembers the rocks. The rocks remember the ancient ocean that deposited them, and the human body, that dark archive of everything it absorbs, remembers too. To stand before a rusted hand pump in a flooded Bangladeshi village after the monsoon rains is to witness a monument to this memory. The pump rises from the brown water, its iron flaking, its handle still working. Water drips from the spout, clear and cold, splashing onto stained concrete. It carries no message visible to the eye, no scent, no color. It is simply water. But it carries, in solution, the geological sentence of 1 billion years. Arsenic, the golden dust of first death, now dissolved as perfectly as a Renaissance poisoner could have wished, democratized into an epidemic that no one decreed. The same chemical indifference that once paused. The heart of an emperor now alters the cellular mitotic clock of a rice farmer's wife. It is not a moral agent. It is an element. It does what it has always done, on a timescale that exceeds human planning. And that, perhaps, is the darkest thing about it. The poison never needed a hand to administer it, only a well to deliver it. The sentence continues, written in water, invisible and patient, waiting to be read by the next generation's skin. The drawer's not locked, but it might as well be. The climate-controlled room, humidity pinned at 50%, temperature a steady 18 degrees Celsius, has done its best to hold the 19th century in a kind of suspended breath. Inside the drawer, beneath a sheet of acid-free tissue, rest 4 objects. A fragment of emerald wallpaper still bearing the ghost of its repeating floral pattern. A white lace glove, its fingertips faintly yellowed as if the wearer had just removed it after a long afternoon. A faded apothecary label with the words, Mana di San Nicola, visible in sepia script, and a small borosilicate vial of soil, sealed with paraffin wax, collected from ground once treated as an orchard floor. A museum conservator, gloved and masked, slides the drawer open during a routine survey. An air monitor clipped to her collar twitches from 0 to a reading of 2.7 parts per billion of arsenic vapor. The emerald wallpaper is exhaling, very slowly, into the 21st century. It has been doing so for more than 140 years. The discovery should not have been a surprise, but it always surprises the junior curators. Textile conservators at the Victoria and Albert Museum discovered long ago that certain green silk gowns, dresses cut in the fashionable silhouette of the 1860s, their skirts voluminous enough to brush against gaslit ballroom floors, still carry arsenic trioxide in concentrations that, if ingested, would be fatal several times over. One dress, a visiting conservator noted in a report from 2005, released arsenic dust onto the testing medium so aggressively that the laboratory repeated the analysis 3 times, convinced of contamination. But no, the green was Paris green, Shields green, emerald green, copper acetoarsenite, copper arsenite, the same pigment that lined nursery walls in damp London townhouses, the same compound that farmers in Massachusetts loaded into their sprayers to protect potato vines from the Colorado beetle, the same crystalline lattice that, half a century earlier, was being painted onto artificial flowers for women to pin into their hair. The gown never stopped being dangerous. Fashion simply walked away and left the poison in the seams. And not only gowns. In a storage box in a botanical collection, a floral wreath made from silk and painted wire, dated to 1887, still glows faintly under X-ray fluorescence analysis with the characteristic spectral signature of arsenic and copper. The wreath was part of a funerary arrangement, placed on a coffin, then kept as a memento of mourning. The conservator who handles it wears nitrile gloves, an N95 respirator, a disposable gown, the same protective equipment required for a hazardous materials spill, and yet she is handling an object once laid gently against a dead woman's hair. The poison has not decayed because arsenic, being an element, does not decay. It does not evaporate into benignity. It does not oxidize into something safe. The long half-life of arsenic in a temperate storage room is the half-life of human memory, which is to say, it is permanent. This persistence constitutes the strangest fact that museum toxicology has handed to the present day. The green that made Victorian rooms and bodies so desirable is, right now, capable of causing exactly the same slow erosion of cellular respiration it caused in the nursery of a child suffering from mysterious gastric crises in 1863. The mechanism is unchanged. Arsenic binds with the sulfhydryl groups of enzymes in the mitochondrial electron transport chain, specifically pyruvate dehydrogenase, and the cell slowly suffocates from within, deprived of the ability to convert glucose into energy. The wallpaper exhales trimethylarsine, a volatile compound produced when mold metabolizes inorganic arsenic. That single garlic-tinged molecule, inhaled in quantities so minute they seemed impossible to harm anyone, crosses the alveolar membrane, dissolves into the bloodstream, and begins the same patient accounting of damage. The dose makes the poison, and the dose from a dress is vanishingly small, but the fact that the dose still exists at all, a century beyond the death of its human host, disturbs something deeper than toxicology. It disturbs the assumption that history stays in its assigned drawer. The same paradox, slightly reconfigured, lives on the surface of a silicon wafer. In clean rooms across Taiwan, South Korea, and upstate New York, semiconductor manufacturers introduce arsine gas, arsenic trihydride, into the crystalline lattice of silicon to donate free electrons, creating the N-type semiconductors that power processors, memory chips, and light-emitting diodes. The gas is acutely toxic. Its presence is monitored by detectors sensitive to 50 parts per billion. Workers wear full supplied air suits when handling cylinders. And yet, a finished microprocessor tucked inside a smartphone contains arsenic atoms pinned in perfectly engineered positions, inert, harmless, not even recognizable as the same substance that once whitened the cheeks of a countess in Vienna. The element that made murder taste of nothing now ensures that a photograph loads in milliseconds. Arsenic did not retreat from the modern world. It entered a new disguise, this time as electrical charge. Veterinary medicine provides a quieter, stranger echo. In the American Midwest, on ranches where cattle graze across former orchard land, a preparation called arsenic trioxide injectable solution is still sold, though under tight regulation, as a treatment for certain parasitic blood diseases in livestock, notably heartwater and anaplasmosis. The dose is calculated by body weight, administered by a veterinarian, and recorded in a logbook that must be available for federal inspection. The label on the bottle, a pharmacist once observed, looks almost exactly like the label on a 19th century apothecary vial of Fowler's solution, if you ignore the modern typeface and the FDA-mandated warnings. The cattle receive an intravenous infusion of the same compound that Giulia Tofana measured into cosmetic bottles in Palermo. The same mechanism that poisons the parasite, binding to sulfhydryl groups, collapsing enzyme function, works on the host's cells too, but at a therapeutic margin narrow enough that the vet's hands, like the hands of the Victorian physician, must be careful. The difference between a cure and an inheritance powder is, as it always was, a matter of arithmetic. And the orchard? The orchard is still there. In Washington State, in the Yakima Valley, soil samples taken from ground that was converted from apple production to suburban housing development in the 1960s still test positive for lead arsenate at concentrations exceeding 20 parts per million. The lead and arsenic bind to soil particles so tightly that they do not leach readily into groundwater, but they do resuspend as dust on dry summer days, and they do adhere to the soles of children's shoes and the paws of dogs. A public health study published in 2017 found that the blood arsenic levels in residents of these communities were not elevated above background, but the background itself had been recalibrated. The entire environment had become the reference range. The old sprayer, rusted and tipped into a hollow, is gone, but the molecules it dispensed have merely migrated from the fruit to the fence post, from the fence post to the dust, from the dust to the archive of the soil. The orchard's accounting is not yet closed. So the question that the museum drawer poses, with its calmly monitored exhalation of Victorian decay, is not, why is this poison still here? But rather, what did we imagine ending would look like? The UK Arsenic Act of 1851 mandated soot and indigo. The United States Environmental Protection Agency phased out chromated copper arsenate for residential lumber in 2003. The World Health Organization set a provisional guideline of 10 micrograms per liter for drinking water. Each of these actions was a genuine and consequential attempt to draw a boundary. But arsenic is an element. It cannot be banned the way a chemical compound can be banned. It was not invented by industry, it was extracted from the earth. And after all the policy, all the regulation, all the remediation, it returns to the earth by 1,000 slow paths. The boundary drawn was always a line in water. The quiet dread of this final archive drawer, then, is not that arsenic might kill again. It will, and it does, daily, in the drinking water of millions across the Ganges, Brahmaputra Delta, and the Mekong floodplain, but that its ambient presence has become a kind of partnership. We use it in the semiconductor that monitors your heart rate while you sleep, in the pesticide that protects your dog from ticks, in the glass of the low emissivity window that keeps your bedroom warm in winter. The poison has been domesticated, not eradicated, but inherited, absorbed into the infrastructure, until it becomes as unremarkable as the copper in a water pipe or the lead in an old city soil. The gown in the drawer is merely the most honest version of a wider truth. None of us has ever stopped wearing arsenic. We have only stopped seeing the color. color: Paris green, emerald green, Shields green. The shade, once so bright it hurt the eye, has now become completely invisible. The dye industry replaced it long ago with synthetic organic compounds that are not acutely toxic, but the cultural memory of the color has not recovered its innocence. An interior designer today will specify a heritage green for a restoration project, and a chemist will formulate it with modern pigments. Yet the historian present will always, privately, notes that the original contained enough arsenic to kill every inhabitant of the room several times over. The color was not a warning, it was an invitation. And the invitation is still propped open, a sliver of emerald wallpaper still breathing its faint garlic note, a lace glove still dusted with a powder that would make a Marsh test mirror bloom like a dark flower inside the glass tube, if anyone cared to run the test again. The test is simple enough. Heat the sample with zinc and sulfuric acid, collect the gas, ignite it, watch the black mirror form on a porcelain surface, and yet no one runs it in the museum. There is no need. The monitoring equipment has already spoken. The archive already knows what it holds. The white glove is the most eloquent object in the drawer, not because it is contaminated. All 4 objects are contaminated, but because it was worn. A woman pulled this glove over her right hand, perhaps in the spring of 1878, and attended a luncheon or a call at a friend's house. And later that evening she removed it and placed it in a drawer, and the arsenic from the glove's dye passed through the barrier of her skin transdermally in a dose so small she would never notice. But the dose repeated itself every Sunday for 2 years, and the mole on her wrist darkened, and her appetite waned, and her physician wrote down nervous dyspepsia in a ledger that can still be found in a private collection, and by the autumn of 1881 she was dead, and nobody mentioned the glove in the inventory of her effects. The glove outlived the wearer. The glove outlived the physician. The glove is now the sole surviving witness, and it is still in a climate-controlled drawer, exhaling the same chemical testimony into the air of a room designed to stop time. Time, though, leaks through the seal. The soil in the vial also breathes, releasing arsenic into the headspace above the paraffin wax at a rate measurable by gas chromatography. This particular soil came from an abandoned orchard in Nova Scotia, where lead arsenate was sprayed from 1910 until 1952. The topsoil contains 35 milligrams of arsenic per kilogram. When the vial was first sealed in 1997, a headspace analysis showed 1,000 micrograms of trimethylarsine per gram of soil. In 2024, the same vial showed 12 10,000 micrograms. The soil is more active now than it was when the trees were still standing. The microbial methylators, fungi, bacteria, the silent decomposers, are still at work, converting inorganic poison into volatile gas, the same chemistry that made the damp London nursery a death chamber. The orchard is not sleeping. The orchard is fermenting. And so the drawer exhales, and the monitor on the conservator's collar ticks upward, and the whole climate-controlled archive becomes, for a moment, a miniature replica of the planet we have made. Arsenic did not disappear into history. History became the medium through which it diffused. The semiconductor, the veterinary infusion, the soil under the housing development, the deep aquifers of South Asia, the painted silk of a mourning wreath, each is a page in a ledger that no government has ever balanced. The bill has not come due because the bill was never issued. The debt is simply carried forward, a line item in the metabolic economy of the earth, the body, the machine. The final testament of arsenic is not that it killed, but that it learned to wait so patiently, in so many guises, that we forgot we were still living inside its experiment. The archive drawer slides shut. The monitor settles back to 0, and the faint, garlic-tinged breath of Victorian decay remains, unresolved, in the sealed air. The descent began with an alabaster jar in a Roman tomb, a golden stain that was both a cosmetic and a chemical warning. We found the vial labeled Manna di San Nicola in a Florentine drawer, its white residue still carrying the signature of quiet widows. We stood in a damp London nursery where emerald wallpaper breathed trimethylarsine into the lungs of sleeping children, and we watched the Marsh test's dark mirror bloom inside a glass tube, a witness that could not tell the difference between a murderer's hand and the geology of a graveyard. What became visible was not a single poisoner, but a pattern. Arsenic did not vanish. It was never defeated by a law, a dye, or a regulatory phase-out. It simply moved into new disguises: the pressure-treated wood of a suburban deck, the clear water of a Bangladeshi tube well, the semiconductor in a smartphone, the injection that cures a cow of parasites. The molecule kept its patience. It outlasted every institution that tried to contain it. The cost that could no longer be hidden is this: we live inside the experiment. The same tasteless powder that rewrote inheritance lines in Renaissance Palermo now flows from aquifers into the rice paddies of the Ganges Delta, affecting tens of millions who never chose to be exposed. The beauty that promised a transparent complexion turned out to be a slow, cumulative death. The cure for syphilis carried its own ledger of delayed liver failure. And the wood that built the playground where you climbed as a child still leaches arsenic into the soil, decades after the industry stopped using it. The distance between what we invent and what we understand is measured in bodies, not in years. The archive does not judge, it only keeps the record. The pressure on the hull begins to ease. The darkness above thins to gray, then to a greenish light. Cold water gives way to the first breath of sea air as the hatch opens. The vessel surfaces, and the recovered evidence comes with us. A fragment of wallpaper, a lace glove, a vial of soil still exhaling its faint garlic note. The file closes, but the truth does not return to the drawer. If this kind of quiet descent into science and history is what you came for, you can subscribe to the Deep Archive. The archive drawer slides shut, the monitor settles back to 0, and the poisoner's perfume remains unresolved in the sealed air.